22 Harleys idling in freezing rain outside a gas station in the middle of nowhere, and a 7-year-old girl with mud on her shoes and terror in her eyes grabs a biker's vest and whispers 5 words that will change everything. Someone has been watching her. Someone has been following her home. And the people who were supposed to protect her, her mother, her teachers, the entire system built to keep children safe, every single one of them looked the other way. But tonight, she found the wrong men to ignore. Or maybe the right ones. Because these broken, battle-scarred riders don't call the police. They don't file reports. They handle it themselves. And what they discover in a trailer hidden deep in the Oregon woods will freeze the blood in your veins. Stay with me until the very end of this one, folks. I promise you, this story will wreck you. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight, and let's ride. The rain came sideways. Not the kind of rain that washes things clean. The kind that punishes. The kind that drives people indoors and makes the world feel like it's trying to drown itself. It hammered the corrugated roof of the Sunoco station on Route 18 outside Black Hollow, Oregon, turning the parking lot into a shallow river that reflected neon green and red and the pale yellow glow of a single overhead lamp buzzing with dying electricity. Rider Ghost Callahan stood beneath the overhang with a cigarette burning between the second and third fingers of his left hand, the hand that still worked properly. His right carried a tremor from a piece of shrapnel that lived somewhere behind his knuckle. The VA doctors said they could remove it, but it might take the nerve with it. Ghost told them he'd rather shake than lose the ability to pull a trigger. That was 6 years ago. He hadn't been back to a VA hospital since. 41 years old. Lean as a stripped wire, eyes the color of wet concrete. A scar ran from the corner of his left eyebrow down to his jaw, earned not in combat, but in a bar parking lot in Reno, when a man twice his size came at him with a broken bottle over a debt Ghost didn't owe. He'd been stitched up by a club brother using fishing line and whiskey. The scar healed crooked. Ghost never bothered to fix it. He never bothered to fix most things about himself. Behind him, 22 Harleys sat in formation across the wet asphalt, engines off, chrome catching rain like scattered diamonds. The Iron Vultures had been riding for 11 hours straight, pushing south from a funeral in Portland. A brother named Dale Fuse Merriman, who'd finally lost his war with the bottle at 53. Heart attack in his sleep. The doctor said it was peaceful. Ghost knew better. Nothing about Fuse's life had been peaceful, so there was no reason to believe death would offer him any courtesy his years on Earth hadn't. The other riders were inside the gas station, crowding the aisles, buying stale coffee and road food. Ghost stayed outside. He always stayed outside. Crowded spaces did something to the wiring in his head that he couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't spent 14 months in a combat zone watching doorways. He pulled on the cigarette, watched the smoke dissolve into the rain, and felt a tiny hand grab the back of his leather vest. Ghost didn't flinch, didn't turn fast. Men who turn fast in the dark scare children. He knew this because he'd scared enough of them in his life. Nieces, neighbors' kids, strangers in grocery stores who saw the tattoos and the dead look in his eyes and pulled their children closer. So he turned slow, deliberate. The way you approach a wounded animal, you don't want to spook. The girl stood behind him in the rain, 7 years old maybe. Slight enough that the wind seemed to push her sideways. She wore a pink t-shirt 2 sizes too big, soaked through and clinging to her ribs, and sneakers caked in mud so thick they looked like they'd been dipped in concrete. A butterfly backpack hung from one shoulder, the zipper broken, the fabric fraying at the seams. Her hair was tangled into wet knots that nobody had brushed in days. And her eyes, dark brown, enormous, swimming with a kind of fear that Ghost recognized instantly because he'd seen it in mirrors for 20 years. The fear of someone who knows the danger is real and knows nobody believes them. "Please don't leave yet," she whispered. Her voice barely broke through the sound of the rain hitting the pavement. But Ghost heard it. He heard it the way a man hears a tripwire click underfoot. Total clarity, total stillness, the whole world narrowing to a single sound. He crouched down, slowly, put the cigarette out against the bottom of his boot, and tucked the dead butt into his vest pocket because he never littered in front of kids, a rule he'd set for himself years ago for reasons he couldn't articulate. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ivy?" "Ivy what?" Mercer. How old are you, Ivy Mercer? 7 3/4. Ghost almost smiled. Almost. The 3/4 mattered when you were 7. Everything mattered when you were 7 because you hadn't yet learned that the world would take most of it away. Where's your mom, Ivy? Working. She works at the diner until 11. Who's watching you? The girl's bottom lip trembled, not the theatrical trembling of a child seeking attention, the mechanical trembling of a body running on fear and adrenaline for so long it had forgotten how to be still. Nobody, she said. Ghost looked past her into the dark parking lot. Beyond the neon glow, beyond the rain, beyond the row of Harleys sitting like sleeping predators in the storm, the road stretched into nothing. Black Hollow was a dying town. Population barely 4,000, most of them hanging on to jobs at the mill or the cannery or the 2 bars that kept their lights on past midnight. Not the kind of place a 7-year-old should be wandering alone at 9:30 at night. Ivy, he said carefully, why are you out here by yourself? She didn't answer right away. She looked over her shoulder toward the road, and Ghost watched her entire body go rigid. The kind of rigid that combat veterans recognize. The kind that says the threat isn't hypothetical. The kind that says it's close. There's a car, Ivy said. What kind of car? Gray. It's always gray. Where? She pointed toward the tree line across the highway. Ghost followed her finger into the darkness and saw nothing at first. Just rain and black asphalt and the shapes of dead winter trees. Then headlights. Parked. Engine running. Sitting in the turnout across the road, pointed directly at the gas station. The lights weren't on full, just the running lamps, barely visible. The kind of setup someone uses when they want to watch without being seen. A gray sedan, domestic, 4-door. Impossible to read the plates from this distance through the rain. Ghost's pulse didn't spike. It slowed. It always slowed when the world showed him something that needed to be dealt with. The VA shrink called it hypervigilance masking as calm. Ghost called it the only useful thing the war had given him. How long has that car been following you? He asked. 4 nights. 4 nights. Not 4 minutes. Not a single occurrence that could be dismissed as coincidence or paranoia. 4 consecutive nights. A pattern. A deliberate, repeated, escalating pattern. And the girl had counted every one of them, which meant she'd been awake every one of them, which meant this 7-year-old had been running her own surveillance operation because the adults in her life had failed to do it for her. Ghost stood up, slowly. Stay right here, he said. Don't move. He walked into the gas station. The fluorescent lights made his eyes hurt after the dark. The iron vultures filled the aisles, big men in leather vests and road-worn boots, some tattooed from wrist to throat, some carrying the kind of quiet that only comes from burying friends in foreign soil. They were buying beef jerky and cigarettes and arguing about whether the rain would break by morning. Ghost walked straight to the back, where Mason Reaper Notscorper Knox stood pouring black coffee into a paper cup. Reaper was the president of the Iron Vultures and looked like he'd been carved from the same granite that lined the Oregon coast, 6'3", 240 pounds, a jaw that could have been used as a doorstop. 51 years old with the posture of a man half his age because the Marines had beaten slouching out of him before he'd turned 20. Former sniper. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. Purple Heart recipient. He'd taken a bullet through the left shoulder in Fallujah and still couldn't sleep on that side. His eyes were the color of dirty ice, and Ghost hadn't seen them soften in the 10 years since Reaper's wife left and took his daughter to a state she refused to name. That loss lived in Reaper like a second skeleton. You could see it in the way he held his coffee, both hands, careful, like he was holding something fragile that might be taken from him again. "We have a problem," Ghost said. Reaper didn't look up. "We always have a problem. This one's different." Something in Ghost's voice made Reaper stop. The coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth. Reaper's eyes lifted and found Ghost's face, and whatever he read there made him set the cup down on the counter. Talk. Little girl, 7, outside alone in the rain, says a car has been following her for 4 nights. Gray sedan parked across the road right now with the engine running. Reaper's jaw tightened. The muscle in his cheek twitched once. To anyone who didn't know him, it would have looked like nothing. To Ghost, it was the equivalent of watching a bomb arm itself. "Where's the mother?" Reaper asked. "Working the night shift at a diner." "Where's the father?" "Didn't ask, but the kid's out here alone in the rain at 9:30, so I'm guessing the answer isn't good." Reaper said nothing for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was a long time for a man who'd made life and death decisions in fractions of one. "Show me," he said. They walked outside together. Ghost led Reaper to the corner of the building where Ivy stood exactly where he'd left her, arms wrapped around herself, shivering hard enough that Ghost could hear her teeth clicking from 5 feet away. Reaper crouched down in front of the girl. This mountain of a man, this walking weapon, lowered himself to one knee on the wet concrete the way a soldier kneels beside a wounded civilian. Slowly, deliberately, making himself smaller so she wouldn't have to look up. "Hey there," he said. His voice dropped to a register Ghost had never heard from him. Low, quiet, like a man talking to his daughter, which was exactly who he was thinking about. "I'm Mason. You cold?" Ivy nodded. Reaper unzipped his riding jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The thing swallowed her whole. She looked like a child wearing a tent made of leather and patches and the faint smell of road and engine oil. "Ghost says someone's been bothering you," Reaper said. "That right?" Another nod. "Can you tell me about it?" Ivy looked at Ghost, then back at Reaper. She was measuring them, deciding. This was a child who'd already learned that adults couldn't be trusted by default, that trust was a currency she couldn't afford to spend carelessly. Ghost recognized the calculation because he'd been making it since he was her age, bouncing between foster homes in Nevada where the only reliable truth was that people who promised safety rarely delivered it. "He sits in the car," Ivy said finally. "Every night, around 8, he parks across from my apartment and just watches." "Watches what?" Reaper asked. "My window." The words hit Ghost like a sucker punch to the chest. He turned toward the road. The gray sedan was still there, headlights still glowing faintly through the rain. Patient, unhurried. The stillness of a predator that doesn't need to rush because it already knows its prey can't escape. "I told my mom," Ivy continued, her voice cracking now. "She said I was seeing things. She said I watched too many scary shows, but I don't even watch scary shows. I watch cartoons about dogs." She said it with such wounded indignation that Ghost felt something crack behind his ribs. Not break, crack. The hairline fracture that happens when you realize a child has been telling the truth, and no one listened. "I told my teacher too," Ivy added. "Mrs. Pemberton. She said sometimes cars just park in neighborhoods and it doesn't mean anything bad." "And what do you think?" Reaper asked. Ivy's eyes went flat. Not angry, not sad. Flat. The way a person's eyes go when they've accepted that they're alone with their fear. "I think he's waiting for something," she said. Reaper stood up. He turned to Ghost, and the two men shared a look that required no words. Ghost had seen that look before, in operating bases at 3 a.m. when intelligence reports came in, and the room went quiet, and everyone understood the same thing at the same time. Something needed to be done, and the people paid to do it weren't going to. Reaper walked back into the gas station. Ghost heard him speak to the brothers. Low, controlled, the way he briefed missions. Ghost couldn't hear the words, but he heard the effect. Boots stopped shuffling, conversations died, and the vending machine hummed into the silence like a mechanical heartbeat. 30 seconds later, 22 iron vultures walked out of that gas station in single file. Nobody spoke. They mounted their bikes in the rain, engines firing one by one, each Harley catching like a controlled detonation until the sound filled the parking lot with a low, rolling thunder that vibrated in Ghost's chest. The neon signs buzzed. The rain fell harder, and the gray sedan across the road sat completely still. Ghost crouched beside Ivy again. "Where's your apartment?" he asked. She told him. 3 miles east, off Franklin Avenue, in a complex called Ridgewood Terrace that Ghost already knew was the kind of place landlords forgot about, and tenants couldn't afford to leave. "We're going to follow you home," Ghost said. "All of us." Ivy stared at him. "All of you?" "All of us." "But there are so many." Ghost looked over his shoulder at the row of idling Harleys, at the silhouettes of scarred men in leather sitting in the rain without complaint, waiting. "Yeah," he said, "there are." He put Ivy on the back of his bike, wrapped her arms around his waist. She weighed nothing. A heartbeat pressed against his spine, warm despite the cold, alive despite everything. The iron vultures rolled out of the gas station in a formation so tight the headlights overlapped, cutting through the rain like a convoy of light through the dark. The sound was enormous. 22 V-twin engines roaring in unison, shaking the road, shaking the trees, shaking the night itself into something different, something that announced without a single word that the rules had changed. Ghost checked his mirror twice. The gray sedan pulled out of the turnout and followed. 3 miles of dark road, no streetlights, just headlights and rain and the enormous sound of engines and Ghost's hands steady on the handlebars with a 7-year-old girl pressed against his back, trusting him, trusting a man covered in scars and bad decisions, more than she'd trusted anyone in weeks. The gray sedan kept its distance. 4 car lengths. 5. Close enough to track them. Far enough to pretend it wasn't. Ghost felt the cold settle into his knuckles. The tremor in his right hand worsened. He squeezed the grip tighter and focused on the road. Ridgewood Terrace appeared out of the rain like a bruise on the landscape. 3 buildings, 2 stories each, brick facades crumbling at the corners. Half the exterior lights were burned out. The parking lot was cratered with potholes deep enough to swallow a tire. A dumpster sat overflowing near the entrance, and the chain-link fence around the property sagged inward, as if it had given up trying to protect anything. The bikers parked in a row along the curb, engines dying one by one until the silence felt like pressure. Rain dripped from chrome and leather, and the edges of baseball caps pulled low over watchful eyes. Ghost helped Ivy off the bike. Reaper was already standing at the entrance, scanning the parking lot with the methodical patience of a man who'd once spent 42 hours lying motionless in a sniper hide in 115-degree heat, waiting. The gray sedan did not follow them into the lot. It stopped across the street. Engine running, lights dimming to nothing, watching. "Apartment 2B, Ivy said, pointing to a second-floor unit with a light on behind thin curtains. Ghost carried her backpack. Reaper walked beside them. 2 other vultures, a massive redhead named Duke who'd served with the Army Rangers, and a quiet man named Tomas, who never spoke about his years in military intelligence, but sometimes woke screaming in languages he shouldn't know, flanked the staircase. Ivy's apartment door was unlocked. Not ajar, not broken. Just unlocked. The kind of unlocked that said whoever was supposed to be watching this child either didn't exist or didn't care enough to turn a deadbolt. Ghost pushed the door open with 2 fingers and stepped inside. Small, clean enough. A kitchen with dishes drying on the counter, a living room with a couch that doubled as someone's bed based on the folded blanket and pillow, and a hallway leading to what Ghost assumed were the bedrooms. A TV played a cartoon on mute. Animated dogs chasing animated cats across a bright landscape that felt obscene, in contrast to the reality Ivy had been living. She hadn't lied to eat about the cartoons. "When does your mom get home?" Ghost asked. 11. Sometimes later if they make her close." It was 9:47. Ghost looked at Reaper. Reaper looked at the window. Thin curtains, bad locks, direct line of sight from the street. A child's bedroom visible from a parked car at night. "We wait," Reaper said. They waited. The bikers spread across the apartment complex like a perimeter defense. 4 on the stairwell, 6 in the parking lot, 3 watching the street from the corner of the building. Ghost stayed inside with Ivy while Reaper stood at the window, arms crossed, staring down at the place where the gray sedan sat in the dark. Ivy sat on the couch with her butterfly backpack on her lap. She hadn't taken off her wet shoes. Ghost noticed this, the way she kept herself ready. Shoes on, backpack close, like a soldier sleeping with his boots laced, a 7-year-old who'd taught herself to be prepared to run. "You want some hot chocolate?" Ghost asked. He didn't know why he said it. He hadn't made hot chocolate for anyone since his sister's kid had been small, and that was years ago. And his sister didn't let him visit anymore because of the incident at Thanksgiving that Ghost didn't like to think about. Ivy looked at him like he'd offered her something impossible. "There's packets in the cabinet," she said. He found them, made 2 cups. The water from the tap ran brown for 3 seconds before clearing. Bad pipes, neglected building, a landlord who collected rent and vanished. Ghost waited until the water ran clean, heated it on a stove with one working burner, and brought the mugs to the couch. Ivy held hers with both hands. The warmth made her stop shivering. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "Are you bad men?" Ghost took a slow sip, burned the roof of his mouth, didn't flinch. "Some people think so," he said. "My mom thinks bikers are bad. Your mom might be right about some of them. But not you?" Ghost considered lying, considered the easy answer, the reassuring platitude that adults feed children to simplify a world that resists simplification. But this girl had been lied to enough. By a mother who dismissed her fear, by a teacher who dismissed it twice, by a system designed to catch people like the man in the gray sedan and somehow missed him entirely. "I've done bad things, Ivy," Ghost said, "but not to kids, never to kids." Ivy studied his face for a long time. The scar, the dead look in his eyes that softened slightly around children in a way he couldn't control. The tremor in his right hand that he steadied against the coffee mug. "Okay," she said, and drank her chocolate. At 11:22 p.m., headlights swept across the apartment window. A rusted Toyota pulled into the parking lot, and a woman stepped out into the rain, pulling a jacket over her head with one hand while the other fumbled for keys. Elena Mercer was 31 years old and looked 45. Not because she wasn't beautiful. She was, in the exhausted, fading way of women who work double shifts and sleep in 4-hour increments and carry guilt for what they can't provide. Her uniform smelled like fryer grease, and the coffee she'd been serving since 6 that morning. Her eyes were red. Her hands were raw. She saw the motorcycles first. 22 Harleys parked in a row outside her building, chrome gleaming under the one working streetlight, men in leather standing in the rain, watching, waiting. Elena froze. Her keys fell from her hand and hit the wet pavement with a sound that was swallowed by the silence. Then she saw Ghost standing in the doorway of her apartment. "Who the hell are you?" she said. Her voice carried the sharpness of a woman who'd learned to weaponize anger because it was the only defense she had. "Why are you in my apartment? Where's my daughter?" "Mom." Ivy appeared behind Ghost. "They helped me." "Get inside, Ivy, now." "Mom, listen. Inside, now." Ivy retreated. Ghost stepped out of the doorway and stood on the landing, giving Elena space. Reaper descended the staircase and stood 3 steps behind Ghost, present but not pressing. A calculated distance, close enough to support, far enough not to threaten. "Ma'am," Ghost said. "My name is Ghost. I'm with the Iron Vultures Motorcycle Club. Your daughter approached me at a gas station tonight because she was scared. She's 7. She gets scared of thunder." "She's not scared of thunder, ma'am. She's scared of a man in a gray sedan who's been parked outside your building for 4 consecutive nights watching her window." Elena's face changed. Not a dramatic shift, subtler than that. The anger didn't leave, but something beneath it moved. Something she'd been pushing down every time Ivy mentioned the car, every time the girl tried to tell her about the headlights and the man and the feeling of being watched. Something Elena had dismissed because dismissing it was easier than accepting it, because accepting it meant the world was more dangerous than she could afford to believe. "That's..." She stopped, swallowed. "She has an imagination." "No, ma'am." Ghost's voice went flat. Not cruel, flat. The flatness of a man delivering battlefield intelligence with no time for comfort. "She doesn't." He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and pulled out a folded paper, opened it, held it under the stairwell light. Photographs. Ghost had sent 2 brothers, Duke and Tomas, to run a quick circuit of the street while the sedan was still parked. Tomas, with his intelligence background, had taken pictures through the sedan's windshield with a long lens before the driver noticed the bikers moving. The photos showed a man in the driver's seat, white male, 40s, baseball cap, holding something in his lap that reflected the glow of a screen, and on that screen, barely visible but unmistakable in the enhanced photo Tomas had cleaned up on his phone, was a photograph of Ivy Mercer walking to school. Elena's knees buckled. Ghost caught her arm, held her up, didn't speak. Sometimes the worst truths need silence around them to land. "Oh God," Elena whispered. "Oh God, she was telling the truth." "She was always telling the truth," Ghost said. Elena covered her mouth with both hands. The rain soaked through her jacket. Her mascara ran. She looked at the row of bikers standing in the dark, then at Ghost, then at the window of her apartment where her daughter's face was pressed against the glass, watching. "What do I do?" Elena asked. Her voice cracked down the middle. "What am I supposed to do?" Reaper stepped forward. Not close, just forward enough to be heard. "You call the police," he said. "Report the vehicle. File for a restraining order. Document everything." "And what do you do?" Elena asked. Reaper looked at Ghost. Ghost looked at the gray sedan still parked across the street, engine still running, still watching. "We do what we do," Reaper said. Elena called the police at 11:38 p.m. A single patrol car arrived at 12:15 a.m. 37 minutes for a report of a child being stalked. The officer, a tired man named Brennan, who looked like he'd been on shift since dawn, took notes with the enthusiasm of someone filling out a form he knew would end up in a drawer. He walked across the street to check the sedan. It was gone. Officer Brennan told Elena there was nothing actionable without a plate number or a positive ID. He suggested she keep her doors locked. He suggested she contact a women's shelter if she felt unsafe. He did not suggest that a man surveilling a 7-year-old's bedroom window was a matter requiring urgency. He did not escalate the report. He did not call a detective. He drove away at 12:31 a.m. Ghost watched the taillights disappear and felt the familiar cold weight settle into his chest. The weight of understanding that the systems built to protect people like Ivy were not broken. They were working exactly as designed. They protected paperwork. They protected process. They protected the comfortable fiction that everything was fine because acknowledging otherwise required effort, resources, and the kind of moral courage that couldn't be measured on a performance review. "That's it?" Elena said from the landing. "That's all they're going to do?" Nobody answered her because the answer was yes, and it was the kind of yes that destroyed something in people when they heard it out loud. Reaper pulled Ghost aside at the base of the staircase. "Tomas got a partial plate," Reaper said. Low, just between them. "Oregon tags. He's running it now." "Through what?" "Through whatever channels Tomas has that none of us ask about." Ghost accepted this. In the Iron Vultures, certain brothers had skills acquired in previous lives that operated in gray areas the club neither endorsed nor questioned. Tomas could find people. That was all anyone needed to know. "What's your read?" Ghost asked. Reaper was quiet for a moment. Rain dripped off the brim of his cap. His eyes tracked the empty street where the sedan had been. "This isn't random," Reaper said. "Man with photos of a kid on his screen watching her window for 4 nights? That's not a custody dispute. That's not a coincidence. That's operational. That's a man with a plan and a timeline." "And if the cops won't move?" Reaper's jaw tightened again. The muscle danced. His eyes found Ghost's and held them. "Then we move," he said. Ghost looked up at the apartment window. Ivy's face was still pressed against the glass, her breath fogging the cold pain, watching the bikers below like they were the only thing standing between her and the dark. And she was right. She was absolutely right. Inside the apartment, Elena sat on the edge of her bed with the door closed, sobbing into a towel so Ivy wouldn't hear. Ghost knew this because he could hear the muffled sound through the thin walls, and it was a sound he recognized. The sound of a mother realizing she'd failed to protect her child. Not out of malice, but out of exhaustion, out of the bone-deep fatigue of doing everything alone and having nothing left over for the thing that mattered most. He didn't knock, didn't intrude. Some pain needed to be private. At 1:47 a.m., Ghost's phone buzzed. A text from Tomas. 6 words. Partial match. Address outside Salem. Moving. Ghost read the text twice. Then he walked downstairs into the rain where Reaper stood smoking beside his bike, and he showed him the screen. Reaper looked at the address for exactly 4 seconds. Then he crushed his cigarette under his boot and said one word. Ride. And somewhere across the wet black miles of empty Oregon highway, in a trailer hidden in the woods that nobody knew existed, A man named Calvin Rourke sat in front of a glowing screen surrounded by photographs of 13 children pinned to the walls. And he had no idea that 22 engines were about to shatter his silence forever. The rain stopped somewhere past mile marker 47, but the cold didn't. It settled into the bones of every rider like a second skeleton made of ice, pressing against muscle and nerve until the only warm things left were engine heat rising through denim and the slow burn of rage sitting behind each man's ribs. 22 Harleys carved through the Oregon dark in tight formation, headlights slicing the fog that crept across the highway like something alive. The road narrowed outside Salem, asphalt giving way to cracked county blacktop, lined with Douglas firs so tall and so close together they swallowed the sky. No streetlights, no houses, no signs of anything human for miles except the distant glow of a radio tower blinking red against the clouds like a mechanical heartbeat, counting down to something nobody could name. Ghost Road Point. Reaper held the center. Tomas navigated from 3 bikes back, phone mounted to his handlebars, GPS coordinates glowing green in the dark. Nobody spoke through the Bluetooth channel. Nobody needed to. The silence between these men carried more information than language. It carried intent, and that intent was singular and absolute. Find the trailer. Find the man. Find the truth about what he was doing to those children. At 2:23 a.m., Tomas's voice crackled through the earpieces. Quarter-mile ahead, dirt access road on the left. No gate. No cameras that I can see from satellite, but that image is 6 months old. How many structures? Reaper asked. 1 trailer. 1 outbuilding. Could be a shed, could be a garage. Power line runs from the county road, so he's got electricity. No registered landline. Cell coverage is marginal out here. Neighbors? Nearest property is a tree farm, 1.5 miles northwest. Nobody's going to hear anything. Ghost felt the weight of that sentence settle across the convoy like a dropped curtain. Nobody's going to hear anything. It was the kind of geography predators chose deliberately. Isolation as infrastructure, distance as defense. A man doesn't hide in the woods because he loves nature. He hides because the things he does require the absence of witnesses. Reaper's voice came through flat and controlled. Kill the headlights at the access road. Engines to idle 200 yards out. Ghost, Duke, Tomas, you're with me on foot. Everyone else holds the road. Nobody enters unless I call it. Confirmations came back in single syllables. Yeah, copy. Got it. The bikes slowed. One by one, headlights died. The convoy crept forward in darkness, guided only by the pale glow of Tomas's GPS and the instincts of men who'd operated in worse conditions in places with names they weren't allowed to say out loud. The dirt access road was exactly where Tomas said it would be. Narrow, rutted, overgrown with weeds that scraped against the bike's fairings like fingernails on a chalkboard. Ghost dismounted first, boots sinking into mud that sucked at his soles. The air smelled like wet pine and something else. Something chemical. Faint. Acrid. The kind of smell that doesn't belong in a forest. Duke appeared beside him, massive and silent. The former ranger moved with a fluidity that contradicted his size, every step placed with the deliberate care of a man who'd spent years learning to move through hostile terrain without making a sound. He carried no weapon visible, but Ghost knew Duke kept a folding knife in his right boot and a collapsible baton in his vest. Old habits from old wars that never really ended. Tomas materialized from the dark like smoke. Smaller than Duke, quieter than Ghost, with eyes that never stopped moving. He held his phone face down against his thigh to kill the glow and leaned close. 200 yards up this road. Trail bends left at a stand of dead birch. The trailer sits in a clearing. Lights? Ghost asked. Can't tell from here. Wind's moving the canopy too much. Reaper stepped between them. He didn't crouch. Didn't huddle. He stood at his full height in the dark and spoke in a voice barely louder than breath. We approach from 3 sides. Ghost, take the east. Duke, west. Tomas, you're with me from the south. If there's a vehicle, I want a plate before anything else. If there's a dog, Duke handles it. What if he's armed? Duke asked. Reaper's pause lasted 1 second. 1 second that contained an entire calculation. Legal risk, moral obligation, the faces of 13 children pinned to a wall that might exist at the end of this road. "Then we make sure we're faster," Reaper said. They moved. Ghost felt the forest close around him like a fist. The trees were thick enough to block what little moonlight the clouds allowed, and the ground was a minefield of roots and stones and dead branches that could snap underfoot and announce their presence. He moved the way the war had taught him, weight on the balls of his feet, each step tested before committed, breathing through his nose in controlled intervals that kept his heart rate below 100. His right hand trembled, the shrapnel, the nerve, the cold making it worse. He squeezed his fist closed and opened it again, forcing blood into the fingers, willing the tremor to stop through sheer stubbornness because that was the only medical intervention he trusted. The clearing appeared suddenly. One moment there were trees, and the next there wasn't, and Ghost was looking at a single-wide trailer sitting in a patch of gravel and mud, surrounded by the dark shapes of the forest. The trailer was old, 70-something vintage, aluminum siding gone green with mildew, one end propped on cinder blocks where the axle had rusted through. A satellite dish sat on the roof, tilted at an angle that suggested amateur installation. Extension cords ran from the trailer to the outbuilding like umbilical cords feeding something alive, and the gray sedan was parked beside it. Same car, same domestic four-door. Organ plates visible now in the faint light leaking from a window on the trailer's far side. Ghost memorized the number automatically, a reflex from years of operating in environments where details kept you alive. A light was on inside the trailer. Not bright. The bluish flicker of a computer screen seen through a curtain that wasn't quite closed. Ghost keyed his earpiece twice. 2 clicks. The signal for "I'm in position" target confirmed. 2 clicks came back from Duke, then 2 from Tomas, then Reaper's voice. 1 word. "Hold." Ghost held. His legs burned from crouching, his knees ached from the cold. The tremor in his hand had migrated to his wrist, a rhythmic shaking he couldn't stop no matter how hard he squeezed. He breathed slowly and watched the trailer window and waited for the signal and felt the minutes stretch like wire pulled to the breaking point. 5 minutes passed, then 10. At the 13-minute mark, Ghost heard a sound that made every nerve in his body fire simultaneously. A child's voice. Not live. Recorded. Playing through speakers inside the trailer. A girl's voice, high and thin, laughing at something Ghost couldn't make out. Then the voice stopped and started again. The same laugh, the same fragment, replayed. Someone was listening to a recording of a child's laughter on repeat. Ghost's vision narrowed, the edges of the clearing blurred. His heartbeat, which had been controlled and steady for the entire approach, suddenly hammered against his ribs with a violence that felt like it would crack bone. The tremor in his hand vanished, replaced by a stillness so absolute that his fingers felt carved from stone. He keyed the earpiece. "Reaper." "I heard it. We need to go in. Now." "Ghost." "Now." Another pause, shorter this time. When Reaper spoke, his voice had changed. The controlled flatness was gone. In its place was something raw, something that sounded like the voice of a father who'd lost his daughter and was listening to a recording of a child's laughter coming from a predator's trailer in the middle of nowhere at 2:30 in the morning. "Go!" Ghost moved fast. Not running. That was how you tripped in the dark and broke an ankle and became useless. But fast. Combat fast. The speed of a man closing distance on a threat, with the understanding that every second of delay is a second the threat has to prepare. He crossed the clearing in 12 strides, reached the trailer door, tested the handle, locked. He didn't kick it, didn't need to. The door was hollow core, mounted on hinges that had rusted thin. Ghost hit it once with his shoulder, 205 pounds of forward momentum concentrated into a space the size of a fist, and the frame splintered inward like balsa wood. The smell hit him first. Stale air. Old food, chemical cleaner, the acrid smell he'd caught outside, stronger now, the kind of industrial disinfectant used to sanitize surfaces. And beneath it, something else, something sweet and wrong that Ghost couldn't identify but that made the skin on the back of his neck prickle with the ancient wordless alarm of a body recognizing danger before the mind can name it. The trailer's interior was one long room divided by a half wall. Kitchen on the left, dishes in the sink, a microwave with a cracked door, a coffee maker still warm. Living space on the right, a recliner facing a desk, two computer monitors glowing blue, cables running along the floor like veins. And the walls. Ghost stopped breathing. The walls were covered. Not with posters or decorations or the random accumulation of a life lived in solitude. They were covered with photographs. Dozens of them. Printed on regular paper, pinned with thumbtacks in rows so precise they looked like a military briefing board. Children's faces. Children walking to school. Children playing in parks. Children entering apartments and houses and getting into cars and standing at bus stops and sitting in classroom windows visible from the street. Each photograph had writing beneath it. Small, neat handwriting in black ink. Names, ages, addresses, school schedules, parents' work hours. Which doors were locked, which weren't. Ghost's eyes found Ivy's photograph in the second row. She was walking alone on a sidewalk he recognized. The stretch of Franklin Avenue between the gas station and Ridgewood Terrace. Her butterfly backpack was visible. Her face was turned slightly toward the camera, as if she'd sensed something watching but couldn't identify what. Beneath the photo, in the same neat handwriting, Ivy Mercer, age 7, Ridgewood Terrace. Apartment 2B. Mother works 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. No father present. Walks alone, Thursdays and Saturdays. Bedroom window faces east. No deadbolt, no alarm. And below that, circled in red ink, easy acquisition. Ghost's hand found the edge of the desk. He gripped it so hard the particle board cracked under his fingers. The room tilted. Not physically, perceptually. The way the world tilts when you encounter something so fundamentally wrong that your brain can't process it through normal channels and starts routing it through the places where rage lives, where violence lives, where the part of you that you keep locked in a cage because civilized people don't let it out starts slamming against the bars. Duke came through the back window. Glass shattered. Cold air rushed in. The big man landed inside the trailer with a sound like a tree falling and immediately went still when he saw the walls. "Jesus," Duke whispered. Then nothing else. Because there was nothing else. Tomas entered through the broken front door and moved directly to the computers. His fingers found the keyboard and began working with the rapid mechanical precision of a man who'd spent years extracting intelligence from enemy hardware. Screens flickered, files opened, folders appeared. "There are hundreds of files," Tomas said. His voice was flat, but his hands were shaking. Organized by state. Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana. Each state folder has subfolders by city. Each city folder has... He stopped. Swallowed. Each city folder has individual profiles. Names, photos, surveillance notes. These go back years. "How many kids?" Reaper asked from the doorway. He hadn't entered the trailer. He stood on the threshold with his arms at his sides and his hands open, fingers spread, and Ghost recognized the posture. A man fighting the urge to close his fists because if he closed them, he wasn't sure he'd stop. Tomas scrolled, counted, scrolled again. 13 active profiles in Oregon alone, he said. But the archive folders. He trailed off, clicked. There are names marked as transferred. Dozens of them, with dates. The word hung in the air like a gunshot echo. Transferred, not freed, not released, not saved. Transferred. The language of logistics, the language of commerce, the language of a man who didn't see children as human beings, but as inventory moving through a pipeline. "Where's the man?" Ghost asked. Everyone stopped. Ghost was right. The trailer was occupied. Lights on, coffee maker warm, computer active, recording still playing on a loop through small desktop speakers. But the chair at the desk was empty. The recliner was empty. The narrow bathroom at the far end of the trailer, door hanging open, was empty. Calvin Rourke was not here. Ghost moved to the window and looked outside. The gray sedan sat in the gravel. Hood cold. He'd been home long enough for the engine to cool, which meant he'd arrived, entered the trailer, and at some point between then and now... "The outbuilding," Duke said. They moved as one. Out the broken door, across the gravel, toward the wooden structure connected to the trailer by extension cords. It was larger up close than it looked from the tree line, maybe 20 by 30 feet, with a corrugated metal roof and walls made of plywood sheets nailed to a timber frame. A padlock hung from the door, but it was unlatched. Open. Ghost pulled the door wide. Inside was a workspace, a long table covered with a printer, a laminating machine, and stacks of paper. A filing cabinet stood against the back wall, drawers labeled with colored tabs. And sitting on a metal chair in the corner, illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, was a man. Calvin Rourke was smaller than Ghost expected. 5'7", maybe. Thin, balding at the crown with a ring of gray-brown hair that needed cutting. Wire-rimmed glasses. A face so unremarkable it could have belonged to any middle-aged man in any small town in America. The kind of face you pass in the grocery store without a second glance. The kind of face that neighbors describe as quiet and kept to himself, and I never would have guessed. He was holding a phone, his thumb hovered over the screen, and when the door opened and 4 men in leather stood in the frame, Rourke didn't run, didn't fight, didn't scream. He pressed send. Then he set the phone down on the table beside him and raised both hands. "You're too late," he said. His voice was calm, conversational. The voice of a man who'd anticipated this moment and prepared for it the way a soldier prepares for capture, by ensuring that the important information was already transmitted before the enemy arrived. Ghost crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbed Rourke by the collar, and slammed him backward off the chair. Rourke hit the plywood wall and slid to the floor, glasses knocked sideways on his face, mouth open in a gasp that sounded more surprised than scared. "Too late for what?" Ghost said. His voice didn't sound like his own. It sounded like something that had crawled out of the locked cage inside his chest and was standing in the room wearing his skin. Rourke looked up at him and smiled. Not a wide smile, not theatrical. A small, tight smile. The smile of a man holding a card he knew was higher than anything on the table. "The profiles were uploaded 20 minutes ago," Rourke said. "All 13. To buyers who've already paid. I saw your bikes on the highway. You weren't exactly subtle, so I moved the timeline up." "What buyers?" Reaper's voice came from the doorway like a blade. "The kind who don't use names," Rourke said. "The kind who use numbers and encrypted channels and addresses that change every 72 hours. The kind who have been doing this longer than any of you have been riding motorcycles." Tomas was already moving. Back to the trailer, back to the computers. Ghost heard his boots on the gravel, then on the trailer's metal steps, then the rapid clicking of keys. Duke stood over Rourke with his arms crossed, blocking the only exit, breathing through his nose in a controlled rhythm that Ghost recognized as the big man's way of not killing someone. Duke had a daughter. She was 12. She lived in Medford with Duke's ex-wife, and Duke drove 4 hours every other weekend to see her, and the idea of her face on one of those walls was doing something to the inside of Duke's head that no amount of controlled breathing could fully contain. "Names," Ghost said. He crouched down to Rourke's level, close enough to smell the man's sweat, close enough to see the rapid pulse in his throat. "Every buyer, every contact, every address." "I don't have names," Rourke said. "That's how it works. Compartmentalization. I collect, I profile, I upload, someone else acquires, someone else transports. I never meet them. They never meet me. The system is designed so that no single point of failure can compromise the entire network." "You're a single point of failure right now," Ghost said. Rourke's smile faded slightly. "I'm one node. You cut me out, they'll replace me inside a week. There are people like me in every state. We find the vulnerabilities, single mothers, absent fathers, underfunded schools, neighborhoods where the streetlights don't work and the cops don't come fast. We find the gaps, and we feed the machine." Ghost hit him. Not hard. Not the way he wanted to. He hit him once, open-handed, across the face, the kind of hit designed to interrupt, to reset, to break through the rehearsed calm of a man who'd clearly prepared a speech for this moment. Rourke's head snapped sideways. His glasses flew off and hit the floor. When he looked back, the composure was cracked. Not broken, but cracked. 13 children, Ghost said. 13 names that you sent to people who will try to take them. I need to know where those buyers operate and how fast they move. Fast, Rourke said. His voice had lost some of its steadiness. Once profiles are uploaded, the acquisition teams verify and move within 72 hours. Some faster, depending on the vulnerability score. Vulnerability score, Duke repeated from behind Ghost. The words came out like he was chewing glass. It's a metric, Rourke said, based on access difficulty, parental oversight, proximity to transportation routes. Duke's boot caught Rourke in the ribs. Not full force. Duke at full force would have cracked the man's chest cavity like a walnut, but hard enough to fold Rourke in half, hard enough to stop the clinical language from leaving his mouth, hard enough to remind everyone in the room that this man was describing children the way logistics companies describe shipping containers. Enough! Reaper's voice cut through the room like a wire. Duke stepped back. Rourke wheezed on the floor, curled around the impact, glasses broken beside him. Reaper walked into the outbuilding and stood over Rourke. He didn't crouch, didn't lower himself. He stood at his full height and looked down at the man with an expression Ghost had only seen once before. In a briefing room in Ramadi, when their unit received intelligence about a weapons cache hidden inside a school, and Reaper's face had gone so still it looked like a photograph of a face rather than the thing itself. "You're going to tell us everything," Reaper said. "Not because we're going to hurt you worse than Duke just did, though we can, but because in about 20 minutes I'm calling the FBI, and when they arrive, they're going to find this trailer and these walls and these computers and you, and the difference between spending the rest of your life in general population and spending it in protective custody is going to depend entirely on how cooperative you were before they got here." Rourke looked up. The composure was gone now. Underneath it was something Ghost recognized, the face of a man realizing that his safety net, the network, the anonymity, the compartmentalization, was theoretical, and the men standing over him were very, very real. "There's a server," Rourke said. "Not here. Remote. The upload goes to a distribution hub that routes profiles to regional buyers. I have the access credentials on the laptop. If someone knows what they're doing, they can pull the transaction logs and trace the buyer nodes." Reaper looked at Ghost. Ghost nodded and walked back to the trailer where Tomas was already deep inside the laptop's file system. "He says there's a server," Ghost said. "Remote. Distribution hub. Can you access it?" Tomas didn't look up. His fingers moved across the keyboard with a speed that seemed inhuman. "I'm already in his email. He's got encrypted channels, but the encryption is commercial grade, not military. Give me the credentials and I can get into the server." Ghost went back to the outbuilding, got the credentials, brought them to Tomas, stood behind him while the smaller man worked in silence, screen after screen of data scrolling past in green and white text that Ghost couldn't read, but Tomas consumed like oxygen. 3 minutes later, Tomas stopped typing. His hands left the keyboard, rested on the edge of the desk. He stared at the screen without moving. "What?" Ghost asked. "The transaction log," Tomas said. His voice was different now. Not flat, not controlled, hollow. The voice of a man staring at something that had emptied him from the inside. "It's not 13 children, Ghost." "How many?" Tomas turned the screen so Ghost could see. A spreadsheet. Hundreds of rows. Each row contained a profile number, a date, a location, a status code. The status codes were simple: pending, transferred, completed. The dates went back 4 years. The locations covered 6 states. Ghost counted the rows marked completed. He stopped at 87. 87 children who had been profiled, uploaded, acquired, and moved through a pipeline so efficient and so invisible that not a single law enforcement agency in the Pacific Northwest had detected it. 87 completed transactions, and 13 more pending, including a 7-year-old girl with a butterfly backpack who was right now sleeping in an apartment with a broken deadbolt, trusting that the men on motorcycles would keep her safe. Ghost's knees nearly gave out. He caught himself on the desk and stood there for a moment, breathing, just breathing, the way the VA shrink had taught him during the sessions he'd stopped attending. In through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 4. The technique that was supposed to prevent the adrenaline spike that preceded the kind of violence Ghost was capable of when the cage door opened. It wasn't working. He walked outside. stood in the cold, looked up at trees he couldn't see and sky he couldn't see, and felt the entire weight of 87 names pressing down on him like a physical force. Reaper found him there. "How bad?" Reaper asked. "Worse than we thought. Worse than anything," Ghost told him. Reaper listened without interrupting. When Ghost finished, Reaper was quiet for a long time. The quiet wasn't empty. It was the sound of a man recalculating every variable in a situation that had just multiplied by a factor of 10. 72 hours, Reaper said finally. That's what he said. 72 hours before the buyers move on the 13 active profiles. Tomas thinks it might be less. Some of the completed transfers in the log happened within 48 hours of upload. Then we have 48 hours to stop 13 children from being taken. Ghost looked at Reaper. We can't do this alone. I know. FBI? FBI. Reaper said the letters like they tasted wrong. Thomas is copying the server data now. Everything. Transaction logs, buyer nodes, communication channels, Rourke's entire archive. We hand it to the feds and we let them do their jobs. And if they don't? Reaper didn't answer. He didn't need to. Both men understood the unspoken truth. They were calling in an agency that might take days to verify evidence that would take hours to act on, and somewhere in the gap between bureaucratic process and real-time danger, 13 children sat in apartments with bad locks and absent parents and no idea that their names were already in the hands of people who wanted to make them disappear. But they also understood something else, something harder, something that sat between them like a loaded weapon on a table. They were not the law. They were bikers, veterans, men with records and reputations, and a relationship with authority that was adversarial on the best days and violent on the worst. If they tried to protect those children themselves, all 13 across multiple cities, against a network they didn't understand, they would fail. Not because they lacked the will or the skill or the willingness to die trying, but because 13 targets across 6 cities required coordination, resources, and legal authority that no motorcycle club possessed. They needed the FBI. And the FBI would need evidence that was admissible in court, not extracted by bikers who'd broken into a trailer without a warrant. There's a problem, Ghost said. I know what the problem is. Everything we found in there, we obtained it illegally. Breaking and entering, no warrant, no probable cause documented through proper channels. A defense attorney could get every piece of evidence thrown out, and Rourke walks, and the network stays intact. Reaper's jaw worked. The muscle in his cheek danced. His eyes were fixed on the trailer where light still glowed blue through the curtain that wasn't quite closed, where Tomas sat copying data that could save 13 children or damn them, depending on which side of a courtroom door it landed on. Then we need someone inside the system, Reaper said. Someone who can receive this information and act on it in a way that doesn't trace back to us. Ghost thought about this. Thought about the people he knew, the bridges he'd burned, the contacts he'd severed when he chose the club over the straight world. And then he thought about one name he hadn't spoken in 3 years. I know someone, Ghost said. FBI field office in Portland. Agent named Delgado. She and I served together. She was a combat medic before she went federal. Can you trust her? I trusted her with my life in Kandahar. That was a different life. Yeah. Ghost paused. But she's the only one I know who will listen to a biker at 3 a.m. and not hang up. Reaper nodded once, slow. The nod of a man authorizing an operation he couldn't control. Ghost pulled out his phone, stared at the screen. The contact was still there. Delgado R. Saved under a name he hadn't called since the night he told her he was done with the straight world. And she told him he was throwing his life away, and they'd stood in a parking lot in Portland screaming at each other until Ghost got on his bike and rode away and didn't look back. 3 years of silence. He pressed call. It rang 4 times, 5, 6. Ghost was about to hang up when the line clicked. Who is this? Rachel Delgado's voice was thick with sleep and sharp with the instinct of a federal agent receiving an unknown call at 2:47 a.m. It's Ghost. Silence. 3 seconds. 4. The kind of silence that carries the weight of every word that was never said, and every call that was never made, and every apology that should have happened, but didn't. You've got to be kidding me, she said. I'm not. I need your help. 13 children are going to disappear within 48 hours, and I'm standing in front of the evidence that can stop it. Another silence. Shorter this time. Talk, she said. Ghost talked. He told her everything. Ivy, the sedan, the trailer, the walls, the profiles, the server, the transaction logs, the 87 completed transfers, the 13 active targets. He talked for 4 minutes without stopping, and Rachel Delgado listened the way she'd listened to incoming radio traffic in combat, without interruption, without judgment, absorbing data at a speed that most people couldn't match. When he finished, she said one sentence. "Don't touch anything else. I'm mobilizing a team. We'll be there by dawn." The line went dead. Ghost lowered the phone, looked at Reaper, looked at the trailer, looked at the outbuilding where Duke still stood over Calvin Rourke, who sat on the floor with broken glasses and a bruised rib and the knowledge that his entire operation was about to collapse. And then Tomas came out of the trailer carrying the laptop and said 6 words that changed everything. "One of the 13 is local. The buyer's already in Black Hollow." Ghost felt the ground shift beneath him. Not the literal ground, the operational ground. The assumption that they had 48 hours. The assumption that the FBI would arrive in time. The assumption that calling the right people and handing over the right evidence would be enough to stop the machine before it swallowed another child. Because somewhere in Black Hollow, Oregon, 3 miles from Ivy Mercer's apartment, 3 miles from the broken deadbolt and the thin curtains and the window that faced the street, someone had already paid for a child. And they weren't waiting 72 hours. They were moving tonight. Tomas spread the laptop across the hood of the gray sedan, screen tilted against the glare of the single bare bulb hanging from the outbuilding's doorframe. Rain had stopped, but the cold hadn't. Breath came out in white clouds that dissolved against the screen's blue glow, while 4 men leaned over data that was rewriting everything they thought they understood about the last 6 hours. "Here," Tomas said. His finger traced a line on the transaction log. Profile number OH-009, 7-year-old female, Black Hollow, Oregon. Status changed from pending to active acquisition at 1:14 a.m. tonight. That's 40 minutes before we even found this trailer. "Which kid?" Ghost asked. Tomas scrolled sideways. The profile expanded. A photograph loaded. Grainy, taken from a distance, the kind of surveillance shot captured with a telephoto lens through a car window. A girl with dark hair standing at a school bus stop. Not Ivy, someone else. Lily Vasquez, Tomas read. Age 7, 1847 Cedar Lane, Black Hollow. Mother works overnight at the cannery. Father deported 18 months ago. Lives with a grandmother who's 73 and partially deaf. Ghost stared at the photograph. Another child. Another gap in the system wide enough for a predator to walk through without touching the sides. Another family held together by exhaustion and love, and not enough of either to cover the blind spots. "Active acquisition," Reaper repeated. "Define that." Tomas pulled up a separate file, a glossary of operational codes embedded in the server's documentation. The kind of internal reference sheet that organizations build when their processes become complex enough to require standardized terminology. The clinical precision of it made Ghost's stomach turn. Active acquisition means a buyer has confirmed intent and a local asset has been activated to execute the pickup, Tomas said. The local asset receives the profile, conducts final surveillance to confirm the target's location and vulnerability, and executes within a compressed window, usually 12 to 24 hours from activation. "That was activated at 1:14 a.m., Ghost said. "It's almost 3. That means the window started almost 2 hours ago." "Which means someone in Black Hollow received Lily Vasquez's profile tonight," Reaper said. "Someone who's not Calvin Rourke, someone we don't know." "A local asset," Tomas confirmed. "Someone already embedded in the community. Someone who can move without drawing attention." The implications settled over the group like a weight. Rourke was the collector, the man who found the vulnerabilities, built the profiles, uploaded the data. But the people who acted on that data were different. They were positioned inside the target communities. They knew the streets. They knew the routines. They looked like neighbors because they were neighbors. Ghost walked back into the outbuilding where Duke still stood over Rourke. The man hadn't moved from the floor. His broken glasses lay beside him, a thin line of blood ran from his nostril where Ghost had struck him, dried now into a dark smear across his upper lip. "The local asset in Black Hollow," Ghost said. "Who is it?" Rourke looked up. The fear had settled into something more permanent now. Not the sharp, reactive fear of the initial confrontation, but the dull, grinding fear of a man who understood that his situation was deteriorating in ways he couldn't reverse. "I told you," Rourke said. "Compartmentalization. I don't know the assets." "You uploaded a child's profile to a buyer who activated a local asset in the same town where you've been conducting surveillance for months. You know the town. You know the people. You know who's operational. The system doesn't work that way. I feed the server. The server feeds the buyers. The buyers deploy their own people. I never see the other side of the transaction." Ghost crouched down. Close. Close enough that Rourke could see the scar, the dead eyes, the complete absence of anything resembling patience. "A 7-year-old girl is going to be taken tonight," Ghost said, "and you're telling me you don't know who's going to take her." Rourke's eyes darted to the doorway where Reaper stood, then back to Ghost, then to Duke, who hadn't moved but whose breathing had changed. Slower now, deeper, the controlled respiration of a man preparing his body for exertion. "I heard things," Rourke said, "on the encrypted channels, before they moved me to the upload-only protocol. There was a name." "What name?" "Whitfield. Someone called Whitfield. I don't know if it's a first name or a last name or a code, but it came up in connection with Oregon acquisitions, multiple times." "Whitfield," Tomas repeated from outside. Ghost heard keys clicking immediately. Ghost held Rourke's gaze for 3 more seconds, reading the man's face the way he'd once read terrain maps, looking for what was hidden, what was covered, what was waiting to kill you behind the next ridge. "Is there anything else you're not telling me?" Rourke hesitated. The hesitation lasted maybe half a second, but Ghost caught it. The flicker in the eyes, the micro-movement of the jaw, the body's involuntary confession before the mouth decided whether to follow. "The buyers," Rourke said, "they don't just take children." "What do you mean?" "The profiles I upload. They include information about the household, who lives there, who might interfere. The buyers use that information to clear obstacles." The words landed like a concussion grenade in a closed room. Clear obstacles. The antiseptic language of a machine that didn't just traffic children, but eliminated anyone who might get in the way. Mothers, grandmothers, neighbors, anyone who might notice, anyone who might fight back, anyone who might scream. Ghost stood up. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else. "Lily Vasquez's grandmother," he said, 73, partially deaf. "She's the only person in that house tonight." Rourke said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was the answer. Ghost was out the door before the silence finished echoing. He grabbed Reaper by the arm, something no member of the Iron Vultures ever did to their president, a breach of protocol so severe it would normally earn a man a week of cold shoulders and club discipline. But Reaper didn't pull away. He looked at Ghost's face and saw whatever was written there and understood that protocol had ceased to exist. "We have to get back to Black Hollow," Ghost said. "Now. Not at dawn. Not when the FBI arrives. Now." Ghost. "There's a girl named Lily Vasquez at 1847 Cedar Lane. She's 7. She lives with her grandmother who can barely hear. The buyer has a local asset moving on her tonight, and that asset has instructions to remove anyone in the way. That old woman is an obstacle in their file. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Reaper understood. Ghost could see it in the way his body changed, the shoulders squaring, the weight shifting forward onto the balls of his feet, the eyes going from analytical to operational in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "Tomas," Reaper called. "Already running it." Keys clicking, screen glow. "Whitfield. There's a Keith Whitfield registered at an address in Black Hollow, 2200 Birch Street, about 6 blocks from Cedar Lane." "What else?" "Property records show he's lived there 11 years. No criminal record that I can find in public databases, but that doesn't mean much. These people are selected specifically because they're invisible. Clean backgrounds. Community ties. The kind of person nobody suspects because there's nothing to suspect." Reaper looked at the sky. Still dark. Hours before dawn. Hours before Agent Delgado and her team would arrive from Portland. Hours during which a 73-year-old woman and a 7-year-old girl sat in a house on Cedar Lane with no idea that someone 6 blocks away had received a file with their address and a set of instructions that ended with them disappearing. "Split the chapter," Reaper said. "Tomas, you stay here with Rourke. Secure the evidence. When the FBI arrives, you hand over everything, everything. And the rest of us? The rest of us ride back to Black Hollow." "All 20? Reaper shook his head. "Too many, too loud. We roll 20 Harleys down Cedar Lane at 3 in the morning and we spook the asset. He goes underground, contacts the network, they scrub the operation and relocate. We lose him, and we lose every connection he has. So what's the play? 4 bikes, Ghost, Duke, me, and Coffin." Coffin. Real name Curtis Wade. The club's sergeant-at-arms. A former Navy corpsman who'd done 3 tours as a combat medic before coming home to find that the VA had lost his paperwork, and the country he'd served had no record of his service. He earned the name Coffin not because he was dangerous, though he was, but because he'd spent more time working on the dead and dying than anyone else in the club and carried that weight in his eyes like pennies placed on a corpse's eyelids. He was standing 30 yards away in the dark, leaning against his bike, smoking a cigarette with the patience of a man who'd watched people die slowly and learned that urgency was a luxury that panic couldn't afford. "Coffin," Reaper called. The red ember of the cigarette moved, boots on gravel, a shape emerging from the dark. 6 feet tall, lean, angular, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts that didn't quite match. Misaligned jaw from a bar fight in Norfolk, crooked nose from a training accident at Camp Lejeune, eyes that were 2 slightly different shades of brown, a genetic quirk that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. "Yeah," Coffin said. "We're going back. A kid's in immediate danger. We need to be quiet." Coffin dropped his cigarette, crushed it, didn't ask for details, didn't need them. The word kid was a complete briefing for men like him. Reaper addressed the remaining riders. 18 men standing in the cold, breath fogging, faces hard. "Hold this perimeter until the feds arrive. Nobody leaves. Nobody touches the evidence. Tomas is in command until I'm back." No arguments. No questions. 18 nods in the dark. 4 bikes fired. The sound was still enormous. 4 Harleys in an empty forest at 3 a.m. made the trees vibrate, but it was a fraction of the full convoy, and within minutes the sound faded behind them as they hit the county blacktop and opened the throttles toward Black Hollow. Ghost rode with his jaw clenched so tight his molars ached. The wind carved through his jacket at 70 miles an hour, numbing his hands, his face, the edges of his ears. The tremor in his right hand had returned with a vengeance, the cold and the adrenaline conspiring to make his grip unreliable. He compensated by locking his wrist, using his forearm as a stabilizer, the way he'd learned to shoot in combat when his hands wouldn't cooperate. 26 minutes. That's how long it took to cover the distance from the trailer to Black Hollow, at speeds that would have earned them all reckless driving charges if there'd been a single cop on the road. 26 minutes of engine noise and freezing wind, and the relentless knowledge that every second was a second in which a 7-year-old girl and her grandmother were unguarded. They killed the engines 2 blocks from Cedar Lane and coasted the last stretch in silence, bikes rolling on momentum alone, tires hissing on wet pavement. The neighborhood was quiet. Small houses set back from the street behind chain-link fences and overgrown hedges, porch lights off, windows dark. The kind of neighborhood that slept hard because the people who lived there worked harder. 1847 Cedar Lane was a single-story bungalow with white siding that had gone gray from years of Oregon rain. A low fence surrounded a small yard with a garden that someone had tended carefully. Even in winter, Ghost could see the shapes of raised beds and the skeletal remains of summer flowers cut back for the season. A light was on in the front room. A television's blue glow flickered behind drawn curtains. The grandmother was awake. Ghost dismounted. Scanned the street. Nothing moved. No cars that didn't belong. No sedans parked at surveillance distances. No headlights. No engines. Then Duke touched his arm and pointed. 2 houses down. Across the street. A pickup truck that hadn't been there when they arrived. Ghost was sure of this because he'd memorized every vehicle on the block in the first 3 seconds, the way combat veterans inventory a room for exits and threats before they consciously register the wallpaper. The truck was dark green, late model, Oregon plates, parked facing Cedar Lane with the cab interior dark, but the driver's side window cracked an inch despite the cold. Someone was sitting inside that truck. Ghost felt the combat calm descend, the slowing of the pulse, the sharpening of peripheral vision, the cold clarity that replaced fear and doubt and hesitation with a single crystalline imperative: act. He signaled to Reaper. 2 fingers, direction of the truck. Reaper saw it, nodded. The 4 of them moved in pairs. Ghost and Duke along the near sidewalk, using the hedgerows for concealment. Reaper and Coffin crossing the street 1 block back, looping behind the truck from the opposite side. A 4-point approach executed without verbal communication, guided entirely by shared training and the muscle memory of men who'd done this in places where the stakes were measured in lives and the margin for error was 0. Ghost reached the truck's passenger side. He could see the silhouette now, a man in the driver's seat, hands on the steering wheel, head turned toward 1847 Cedar Lane, watching. The same posture as the gray sedan outside Ivy's apartment, the same patient stillness of someone waiting for the right moment to move. Ghost looked through the cracked window and saw what the man was holding in his lap. A phone displaying a photograph of Lily Vasquez, and beside the phone, lying on the passenger seat in a clear plastic bag, a bottle of liquid and a cloth. Ghost recognized the setup instantly, the same kit he'd seen described in hostage rescue briefings during his military service. Chemical restraint, designed to incapacitate quickly and leave minimal evidence. Ghost didn't think. Thinking was for situations where options existed. This was not one of those situations. He grabbed the door handle, locked. He slammed the heel of his palm against the window, once, twice, cracking the glass on the second hit, spiderwebbing it on the third. The man inside lurched sideways, eyes wide, mouth opening to scream or shout or curse. Reaper was already at the driver's side. He reached through the cracked window, unlocked the door, ripped it open, and grabbed the man by the collar of his jacket with one hand, while the other found the man's wrist and twisted it backward in a joint lock so fast the movement looked rehearsed. The man screamed, not loud. The pain cut through his vocal cords before the scream fully formed, turning it into a compressed, strangled sound that died in the back of his throat. Duke pulled the phone from the man's lap. Coffin secured the plastic bag from the passenger seat, holding it by the corner with 2 fingers, evidence preservation instincts from years of combat documentation kicking in automatically. Reaper pulled the man from the truck and forced him to the ground. Face against wet asphalt, hands pinned behind his back. The man was average height, average build, wearing a dark jacket and jeans and work boots that looked like they'd been purchased for the specific purpose of not looking memorable. His face, pressed sideways against the pavement, was unremarkable in the same way Rourke's had been. The face of someone designed to disappear into the background of normal life. "Keith Whitfield?" Reaper said. The man's eyes went wide. The sound of his own name hit him harder than the pavement had. The realization that these weren't random bikers, that they knew who he was, that the compartmentalized anonymity he'd been promised had failed. I'm not... You've got the wrong... We've got the profile on your phone, Ghost said. He crouched beside the man's head. We've got the chemical kit on your seat. We've got your address, your name, and a server full of transaction logs that connect you to a network trafficking children across 6 states. So let's skip the part where you pretend to be confused. Whitfield stopped struggling. His body went limp against the pavement in the sudden, total surrender of a man whose options had collapsed from every direction at once. Ghost had seen this before, in interrogation rooms, in combat surrenders. In the moment a captured enemy combatant realizes that the fight is over and the only remaining variable is how much pain the next few minutes will contain. "I want a lawyer," Whitfield said. "We're not cops," Duke said. Whitfield's face changed. The remaining color drained from it. The difference between being caught by law enforcement and being caught by 4 bikers on a dark street at 3 in the morning was the difference between a system with rules and a system without them, and Whitfield could see that difference written in the scars and the tattoos and the flat, exhausted eyes of the men holding him down. "How many times have you done this?" Ghost asked. I want... How many children? Whitfield pressed his lips together, shut his eyes. The posture of a man who had decided to stop talking, to retreat behind the only wall he had left. Silence. Ghost let him. For now. Reaper stood up and pulled Ghost aside. They stood in the shadow of a hedge while Duke kept Whitfield pinned and Coffin photographed the contents of the truck with his phone. The chemical kit, the phone, the profile, the driver's license in the glove compartment that confirmed Keith M. Whitfield, 2200 Birch Street, Black Hollow, OR. We've got him, Reaper said. But this isn't a courtroom. We need to secure the girl and her grandmother and hold this man until Delgado's team arrives. Agreed. Ghost. Reaper paused. There's something else. What? Tomas texted me while we were riding. He found something in the server he didn't mention on the comm channel. Didn't want the other brothers to hear. What did he find? Reaper pulled out his phone, opened a message, turned the screen toward Ghost. It was a screenshot of an internal communication from the network's encrypted channel. A message dated 3 weeks ago, routed through the same server Tomas had accessed. The message was brief. Black Hollow asset confirms law enforcement contact active. Officer on payroll. Weekly intelligence reports on patrol schedules, CPS investigations, and mandatory reporting compliance. Asset secure. Ghost read it twice. 3 times. The words didn't change. Law enforcement contact active. Officer on payroll. Someone inside the Black Hollow Police Department was feeding information to the trafficking network. Patrol schedules, so the assets knew when to move without being seen. CPS investigations, so they knew which families were already flagged and which could disappear without triggering institutional alarm. Mandatory reporting compliance, so they knew which teachers and doctors and social workers were actually filing reports and which were letting things slide. Officer Brennan, the tired man who'd arrived 37 minutes late, who'd taken notes without urgency, who'd walked across the street to check a sedan that was conveniently gone, who'd told Elena Mercer there was nothing actionable and suggested she keep her doors locked, the officer who hadn't escalated the report, who hadn't called a detective, who'd driven away at 12:31 a.m. with the calm efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly what he was protecting. Ghost's body went cold. Not the cold of the Oregon night, a deeper cold. The cold of realizing that the systems he'd already known were broken were worse than broken. They were compromised, infiltrated, turned against the people they were designed to protect by someone wearing the same uniform that was supposed to represent safety. Brennan, Ghost said. We don't know that for certain, Reaper said. The message doesn't name the officer. Brennan responded to Elena's call tonight. He was the only officer on scene. He let the sedan drive away without pursuing. He didn't file an escalation report. He didn't call a detective. Circumstantial. Reaper. He told a single mother to lock her doors and contact a women's shelter while a man was surveilling her 7-year-old daughter through a bedroom window. That's not incompetence. That's cover. Reaper was silent. Ghost watched him process the information the way a computer processes a system-level error. Not emotionally, not reactively, but structurally. Recalculating every interaction, every assumption, every moment of the night through the lens of this new variable. If Brennan is compromised, Reaper said slowly, then the call Elena made tonight went through his hands, which means the network knows that Ivy was reported, that bikers were involved, that someone is actively interfering with their operation. Which means they know about us. Which means we're not just in a race against the clock. We're in a race against a network that already knows we're coming. Ghost felt the ground shift again. For the second time tonight, the operational landscape had changed beneath his feet. First at the trailer when the scale of the network revealed itself, and now on this dark street when the depth of its penetration became clear. This wasn't a lone predator. This wasn't even a network of predators operating in the shadows. This was a machine with tendrils inside the institutions meant to stop it. Police, possibly more. A system that had survived for 4 years and 87 completed transactions because it had people on the inside ensuring it would never be detected. Ghost thought about Ivy sleeping in her apartment with a deadbolt that didn't lock. He thought about Elena, who'd called the police and handed her daughter's situation directly to someone who might be working for the people who wanted to take her. He thought about Officer Brennan driving away at 12:31 a.m., with Ivy's address and her mother's work schedule, and the knowledge that a motorcycle club was involved, information that would be invaluable to a network deciding how to respond. "We need to get Ivy out of that apartment," Ghost said. "Ghost! Reaper, listen to me. If Brennan passed Elena's report to the network, they know exactly where Ivy is. They know her mother called the police. They know bikers showed up. And they know we left. If they're as efficient as these transaction logs suggest, they won't wait for another night. They'll move on Ivy now, tonight, while we're here on Cedar Lane, 3 miles from her building." The silence between them was the worst kind, the kind that confirms the thing you're most afraid of. Reaper's hand went to his phone. He dialed Tomas. "How many brothers are still at Ridgewood Terrace?" Reaper asked. "None," Tomas said. "You pulled everyone to the trailer site." Ghost was already running toward his bike. "Cedar Lane to Ridgewood Terrace. 3 miles. 4 minutes if he pushed the engine hard enough to crack the speed limit in half. 4 minutes during which a 7-year-old girl and her mother sat in an apartment that every member of the Iron Vultures had left unguarded because they'd been chasing the network into the woods while the network circled back toward the one child they'd sworn to protect. Reaper was behind him. Duke secured Whitfield to the truck's steering column with zip ties and sprinted for his Harley. Coffin stayed with the prisoner and the girl on Cedar Lane. Someone had to, and Coffin understood triage the way combat medics understand it, the brutal calculus of deciding who needs you most when everyone needs you at once. 3 bikes fired. 3 engines shattered the silence of Cedar Lane. 3 Harleys screamed into the dark toward Ridgewood Terrace. Ghost's phone rang as he hit Franklin Avenue. He answered on speaker, holding the handlebars with hands that weren't shaking anymore because the fear had burned through the tremor and left something harder in its place. "Ghost," Tomas's voice was tight. "I just pulled Brennan's patrol logs from the county dispatch system. He responded to Elena's call tonight off route. His assigned patrol sector is west side. Ridgewood Terrace is east." He wasn't dispatched. He self-assigned, took the call before the east side unit could respond. And Ghost, he logged the call as resolved. Code 4. No further action. The east side unit never knew it happened. Code 4. All clear. The universal signal that a situation has been handled and no additional resources are needed. Brennan had intercepted Elena's call, responded personally, performed the appearance of an investigation, cleared the scene, and buried the report before anyone else in the department could see it. He hadn't been lazy. He'd been precise. Ghost leaned forward over the handlebars and pushed the Harley past 90. The engine screamed beneath him. The wind tore tears from his eyes that froze against his cheekbones. The road blurred into a stream of dark pavement and white lane markers and the distant shapes of buildings that meant he was close, almost there, almost back to the apartment where he'd made hot chocolate for a girl who trusted him more than she trusted anyone, and he'd left her. He'd left her to chase a lead into the woods while the real danger doubled back. Ridgewood Terrace appeared ahead. Dark, silent, the same crumbling brick, the same broken streetlight, the same parking lot cratered with potholes. And parked in front of Building B, engine running, lights off, was a black hollow police cruiser. Ghost killed his engine and coasted the last 100 yards in silence. He dismounted before the bike fully stopped, letting it drop against the curb with a metallic crash he didn't care about. Reaper was beside him. Duke, 30 seconds behind. The cruiser was empty, driver's side door ajar. The interior computer screen glowed with a dispatch log showing one active call. Welfare check, 2B Ridgewood Terrace. Officer Brennan responding. A welfare check. At 3:47 a.m., on a unit Brennan had already cleared hours ago, on a family whose report he'd buried. Ghost took the stairs 3 at a time. His boots hit the concrete landing of the second floor, and he saw the door to apartment 2B standing open. Not broken, not forced, open. The way a door opens when someone with a badge knocks, and a frightened woman lets him in because she has no reason not to trust the uniform. He crossed the threshold and found Elena standing in the living room in her bathrobe, arms crossed over her chest, face white. Officer Brennan stood in the kitchen doorway, still in uniform, badge still clipped to his chest, one hand resting casually on his belt near the radio he hadn't used once tonight. And Ivy's bedroom door was closed. "Ma'am, As I explained, Brennan was saying in a calm, professional voice that made Ghost's skin crawl. Given the nature of tonight's events, Child Protective Services has recommended an immediate welfare assessment. I just need to speak with your daughter briefly and confirm. Step away from the door, Ghost said. Brennan turned. His face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: surprise, recognition, calculation. The calculation was the most dangerous one. Ghost could see it happening in real time. Brennan assessing the situation, measuring his options, deciding how to play this. Sir, this is an active police welfare check, Brennan said. His voice stayed calm, practiced. I'm going to need you to step outside. CPS didn't send you, Ghost said. You're not on a welfare check. There's no dispatch record because you self-assigned, the same way you self-assigned Elena's call 4 hours ago. Brennan's hand moved from the radio to his hip, not to the weapon, to the space beside it, a positioning move, readiness without commitment. I don't know what you think you... We found the trailer, Ghost said. We found the server. We found the transaction logs and the 87 completed transfers and the encrypted message confirming a law enforcement contact on the network's payroll in Black Hollow. So drop the act, Brennan, because the FBI is already en route, and the only question left is whether you're standing in this apartment when they get here or walking out of it in front of me. Elena's face collapsed. She looked at Brennan, then at Ghost, then back at Brennan, the realization hitting her in waves that the man she'd let into her apartment, the officer she'd trusted because the badge said she should, was part of the machine that wanted to take her daughter. Elena, Ghost said without taking his eyes off Brennan, take Ivy. Go to the bedroom. Lock the door. Elena didn't hesitate. She moved down the hallway, opened Ivy's door, stepped inside, and the lock clicked behind her. Brennan and Ghost stood 6 feet apart in a kitchen that smelled like cold coffee and dish soap. Brennan's hand was still on his hip. Ghost's hands were at his sides. Empty. Open. The tremor completely gone, replaced by the absolute stillness that comes when the body understands that what happens next will be decided not by planning or preparation or protocol, but by which man moves first and which man doesn't move fast enough. Behind Ghost, Reaper's boots hit the landing, and behind Brennan, through the thin kitchen wall, Ghost heard Ivy's small voice ask her mother a question that broke something inside him that he wasn't sure could be put back together. Mommy, why is the policeman here again? Is he going to help us this time? Brennan's hand moved, not toward the weapon on his hip, toward the radio on his shoulder. A calculated reach, Geet. The kind of motion a man makes when he wants to call for backup or broadcast a distress signal that would bring every on-duty officer in Black Hollow to this apartment within minutes. A motion that would flood this building with uniforms and sirens and the institutional authority that Brennan had been hiding behind all night. Ghost closed the distance in 2 steps. His left hand caught Brennan's wrist before the fingers touched the radio. His right, the one with the tremor, the one that shook every waking hour of every miserable day, locked around the radio itself and ripped it from the shoulder mount with a single twist that snapped the clip and sent the battery cover skittering across the kitchen floor. Brennan swung with his free hand, a wild, panicked hook that caught Ghost on the side of the jaw. Not hard. Not trained. The punch of a man who'd spent his career behind a badge and a clipboard and had never been in a fight where the other person wasn't already handcuffed. Ghost absorbed the impact without moving his feet. He'd taken worse from better men in worse places, and the pain was nothing, a dull flash that registered and disappeared like a match struck in the rain. Ghost twisted Brennan's wrist inward and drove the officer backward against the refrigerator. Magnets scattered, a child's drawing, purple flowers, a yellow sun, the word "mommy" written in crooked letters, fluttered to the floor. Brennan's back hit the appliance hard enough to dent the door panel, and the air left his lungs in a compressed grunt that sounded like a tire puncturing. "Don't," Ghost said. One word, low, the voice he used when he meant something so completely that additional words would only dilute it. Reaper stepped through the apartment door. His eyes swept the scene, Ghost pinning Brennan against the fridge, the radio in pieces on the floor, the hallway where Elena and Ivy were locked behind a bedroom door. He processed it in under 2 seconds and positioned himself at the kitchen entrance, blocking the only exit with his body the way a wall blocks wind. "Officer Brennan," Reaper said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. The calm of deep water. The calm of a man who'd watched people die through a rifle scope from 800 yards and felt nothing but the recoil. "You have about 90 seconds to explain what you're doing in this apartment before the FBI arrives, and the explanation becomes someone else's problem." Brennan's face was red. Veins stood out on his forehead. His eyes moved between Ghost and Reaper with the frantic calculation of a cornered animal measuring the distance to every wall. "You're assaulting a police officer," Brennan said. His voice cracked on the last word. "That's a felony, both of you." "I'll have your—" "You came here to take a child," Ghost said. "That's insane. I'm conducting a welfare—" "There is no welfare check. There's no CPS referral. You self-assigned this call the same way you self-assigned Elena's call 4 hours ago. You're here because the network flagged this address, and you're the asset that clears the path." "I don't know what network you're talking about." "Then explain the encrypted message," Reaper said. "Law enforcement contact active. Officer on payroll. Weekly intelligence reports on patrol schedules." "That ring any bells, officer?" Something broke behind Brennan's eyes. Not his composure, that was already gone. Something deeper. The last thin membrane of denial that separated the man he pretended to be from the man he actually was. Ghost watched it happen the way you watch glass fracture in slow motion. Invisible stress lines spreading outward from a single point of impact until the entire structure fails at once. Brennan stopped struggling. His body went slack against the refrigerator. His arms dropped to his sides. His chin lowered to his chest. And when he spoke, his voice was different, smaller. The voice of a man who'd been holding a mask in place for so long that removing it felt like removing skin. "You don't understand," Brennan said. "Then help us understand," Reaper said. "They have my son." The words dropped into the kitchen like stones into still water. Ghost's grip on Brennan's collar loosened by a fraction. Not a conscious decision, but a reflexive response to information that didn't fit the architecture of what he thought he knew. He'd been operating under a clear framework. Brennan was compromised. Brennan was complicit. Brennan was an enemy embedded inside the system. But those 3 words, "They have my son," introduced a variable that complicated everything. "Explain," Ghost said. Brennan's eyes were wet, not theatrical tears. The kind of moisture that comes from a pressure so extreme it forces fluid through the only available exit. "My boy, Caleb. He's 9. He lives with my ex-wife in Bend. 2 years ago, a man contacted me, said he knew where Caleb went to school, what time he got picked up, what route my ex-wife drove home. He showed me photographs, recent ones. Caleb at soccer practice, Caleb at the library, Caleb eating lunch through a cafeteria window." Brennan's voice broke. He steadied it the way a man steadies a broken bone, by holding it rigid and accepting that the pain was the price of function. He said if I cooperated, Caleb would be safe. If I didn't, Caleb would become a profile. Those were his exact words. Become a profile. I didn't even know what that meant until he explained the system. And then I understood that the only reason my son wasn't already in their files was because they decided I was more useful as an asset than Caleb was as a target. Ghost released Brennan's collar, stepped back, not out of sympathy, out of the need for distance. The need to see the full picture rather than the close-up, because close-up showed emotion and he needed information. "How long?" Ghost asked. 22 months. "What do they make you do?" "Patrol schedules. I send them my shift assignments every week. They know when and where every officer in this department will be, down to the hour. CPS flags. If a child abuse investigation opens in the county, I report it so they can determine if any of their targets are at risk of being removed from accessible households. And if a report comes in about suspicious activity near one of their targets," Brennan swallowed. "I intercept it. Respond personally. Clear it. Make sure it never reaches a detective's desk." "Like tonight," Ghost said. "Like tonight." "How many times?" Brennan closed his eyes. 11. 11 reports in 22 months that I buried. Parents calling about strange cars. Neighbors noticing unfamiliar people watching their kids. Teachers flagging behavioral changes. 11 times someone tried to tell someone something was wrong, and I made sure the system never heard it. The weight of that number settled into the room. 11 buried reports. 11 moments where the system might have caught the network, might have saved a child, might have unraveled the entire operation years earlier. And each time, a man wearing a badge had intercepted the alarm and silenced it. Not because he was evil, because he was terrified. Because the machine had found his vulnerability the same way it found every vulnerability, through the people you loved most, and turned it into leverage. Ghost thought about Ivy's face pressed against the window, about Elena calling 911 and getting the one officer in the department who'd been placed there specifically to make sure her call went nowhere. "The welfare check tonight," Ghost said. "Were you here to take Ivy?" "No." Brennan opened his eyes. "I was here to confirm she was still in the apartment. They don't use me for acquisitions. I'm intelligence. I feed them data and they leave Caleb alone. But tonight, after your club showed up and everything went sideways, I got a message. They wanted to know if the target was still viable, if the mother was still here, if the bikers had left. And you came to check. If I don't respond, they escalate. And escalation means Caleb's name enters the system." Reaper stepped forward, not threatening, controlled. His voice carried the precision of a man who'd spent decades making critical decisions under conditions that would break most people. "Brennan, listen carefully. The FBI is en route from Portland. They have the server data, the transaction logs, and the encrypted communications that prove law enforcement involvement. When they arrive, they will tear this department apart. Your name will surface. Your role will surface. There is no version of the next 24 hours where you walk away from this." Brennan nodded, a small, defeated motion. "But there is a version," Reaper continued, "where you help us protect these children right now, and your cooperation is documented before the feds arrive. There's a version where your son's situation is part of the record, where Caleb's safety becomes the FBI's responsibility instead of yours." "You don't know these people," Brennan said. "They're not amateurs. The network has assets in law enforcement across 3 states. I'm not the only one. There are officers in Salem, Portland, Boise. They have people inside school administrations, inside family courts, inside CPS itself. This thing goes deeper than you can imagine." "Then help us imagine it," Ghost said. Brennan looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was silent except for the hum of the damaged refrigerator and the distant sound of Ivy's voice behind the bedroom door. Muffled, indistinct, a child talking to her mother in the middle of the night because a man with a badge had come to their home and the world no longer made sense. "There's a coordination hub," Brennan said. "Not the server Rourke used. That's the intake side, the profiling and distribution system. I'm talking about the operational hub. The people who manage the assets, run the logistics, handle the money. They operate out of a commercial property on the east side of Salem. It's registered as a data processing company. Meridian Analytics. I've never been inside, but I've delivered reports there twice. Hard copies, hand-delivered, because some things don't go through electronic channels. How many people? I don't know. I only ever met one. A woman named Carver. First name or last, I couldn't tell you. She took my reports, asked specific questions about patrol coverage, and sent me home. But the building had multiple offices. There were cars in the lot both times, 5 or 6 at least. Security? Electronic, keycard entry, cameras on the exterior. No visible armed presence, but that doesn't mean there wasn't one." Reaper was already texting. Ghost knew the message was going to Tomas, everything Brennan was saying transcribed in real time, added to the evidence package being compiled for Agent Delgado. Ghost's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. "Delgado? ETA 47 minutes. Mobilize Joint Task Force from Portland Field Office. 22 agents. SWAT on standby. Send everything you have. 47 minutes. Less than an hour before federal resources would descend on Black Hollow, with the authority and firepower to dismantle a trafficking network that had operated in darkness for 4 years. 47 minutes that should have felt like relief. But Ghost couldn't stop thinking about the 13 active profiles. The 12 children outside Black Hollow, whose names were in the hands of buyers and assets scattered across the Pacific Northwest. Ivy was here, guarded. Lily Vasquez was secured on Cedar Lane, with coffins standing watch. But the other 11 were scattered across Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, in apartments and houses and neighborhoods where no one was coming, where no motorcycle club was going to materialize out of the rain at the last moment. The other targets, Ghost said. The 11 active profiles outside Black Hollow. How fast can the network move on them? Brennan shook his head. I told you, once profiles go active, acquisition teams move within 72 hours. I know. But Rourke said he accelerated the upload because he saw us coming. Does that mean the acquisition timeline also accelerated? I don't know. I'm not on the operational side. But if the network detected a threat, if they know their profiling node was compromised, standard protocol would be to execute all pending acquisitions immediately before the evidence chain leads back to the buyers. Burn the operation and grab what you can, Duke said from the doorway. Ghost hadn't heard the big man come in. Duke filled the frame like a human barricade, face hard, eyes locked on Brennan with the particular intensity of a father listening to a man describe a system designed to steal children. Exactly, Brennan said. They'll accelerate everything, if they haven't already. Ghost called Delgado. She answered on the first ring. 47 minutes isn't fast enough, Ghost said. The network knows it's compromised. They're going to execute all pending acquisitions now, tonight, 11 children across 3 states. Ghost, I can't mobilize federal resources any faster than... I'm not asking you to mobilize faster. I'm asking you to contact the field offices in those cities and get local agents to the addresses on the active profiles. Tomas is sending you the complete list right now. Names, addresses, ages, everything. Silence on the line. 2 seconds. 3. Ghost could hear the machinery of a federal agent's mind processing an operational request from a civilian biker at 4 in the morning, the jurisdictional complications, the chain of command issues, the political risk of mobilizing multiple field offices based on evidence obtained by a motorcycle club through illegal entry. Send the list, Delgado said. I'll make the calls. The line went dead. Ghost looked at Reaper. Both men understood the fragility of what was happening. An FBI agent making phone calls in the middle of the night to field offices across the Northwest, requesting emergency protective details on 11 addresses based on a data dump from a biker who'd broken into a trailer in the woods. Some of those field offices would respond. Some wouldn't. Some would verify before acting. Some would act before verifying. And in the gaps between those responses, children would either be saved or lost. We've done what we can from here, Reaper said. It's not enough. It never is. Reaper's voice carried a weight that Ghost recognized. The weight of a man who'd spent a lifetime arriving too late. Too late for the soldiers who died before the medevac landed. Too late for the civilians caught in crossfire that smarter decisions could have prevented. Too late for his own daughter, who disappeared into a custody arrangement he couldn't fight because the court looked at his tattoos and his club affiliation and decided he wasn't fit. Some men carried that weight and crumbled. Reaper carried it and stood straighter, as if daring gravity to do its worst. Elena emerged from the hallway. Ivy was behind her, clutching her mother's bathrobe with one hand and the butterfly backpack with the other. The child's eyes swept the room. Ghost against the counter, Reaper in the doorway, Brennan slumped against the refrigerator, Duke blocking the entrance like a wall of leather and silence. What's happening? Elena asked. Her voice was raw, scraped clean of everything except the primal need to understand the threat level so she could calibrate her fear. We need to move you, Ghost said. Both of you, tonight. This apartment isn't safe. Move us where? The Iron Vultures have a clubhouse on Route 7, 8 miles north. Reinforced building, gated property, brothers on site around the clock. You want me to take my daughter to a biker clubhouse? I want you to take your daughter somewhere that the people trying to hurt her can't reach. Elena looked at Brennan, the officer who'd stood in her kitchen and lied to her face. The man whose badge was supposed to mean safety and instead meant the opposite. Ghost watched her process the betrayal. Not with anger, not yet, but with the slow, devastating recalibration of a woman realizing that the last institution she trusted had been weaponized against her child. Okay, Elena said. One word. the heaviest word a mother can say when it means giving up control and placing her child's life in the hands of strangers who ride motorcycles and carry scars and look like the kind of men she'd spent her whole life avoiding. Ivy tugged on Ghost's vest. He looked down. "Are we going on the bike again?" she asked. "Yeah, kid. One more ride." "Is the bad man going to follow us?" Ghost crouched down, eye level, the same way he'd met her the first time, outside the gas station in the rain, when she was a terrified girl clutching a butterfly backpack, and he was a broken man who'd forgotten what it felt like to be trusted. "Nobody is going to follow you," he said. "Not tonight. Not ever again." Ivy studied his face. The scar, the exhaustion. The eyes that had seen things no person should see and carried the evidence in their permanent expression. She reached out and touched the tremor in his right hand, just laid her small fingers against his shaking knuckles with the unbearable gentleness of a child who recognizes damage in another person because she carries her own. "Your hand shakes," she said. "I know." "Does it hurt?" "Sometimes. My stomach hurts when I'm scared. My counselor says it's because feelings live in your body, not just your head." Ghost felt something move behind his ribs, not the crack from earlier, something deeper, something that had been locked in the cage alongside the rage and the violence and the self-destruction, something he'd forgotten was in there because he'd stopped looking. "Your counselor sounds smart," he said. "She's okay. She has a plant on her desk that's dying, though. She should water it more." Despite everything, the terror, the exhaustion, the knowledge that somewhere in the dark a network was scrambling to steal children before the walls closed in, Ghost almost laughed. Almost. The sound caught in his throat and stayed there, trapped between the man he was and the man this 7-year-old seemed to think he could be. They moved fast. Elena packed a bag in 4 minutes, clothes for Ivy, her own work uniform, documents, medication. Duke carried the bag. Reaper led. Ghost carried Ivy down the stairs to his bike, her arms wrapped around his neck, her butterfly backpack bouncing against his chest. Brennan came with them. Not voluntarily. Duke walked behind him with a hand on his shoulder that weighed approximately the same as an anvil, guiding him toward the bikes with the patient, implacable force of a man who understood that this officer was both a criminal and a victim, and that sorting out which was which would be someone else's job. The parking lot was dark. The police cruiser sat empty, interior light fading. Ghost scanned the street out of habit, the same habit that had saved his life in Kandahar, in Reno, in a dozen parking lots and back roads where the world showed its teeth without warning. Something moved. At the edge of the parking lot, near the dumpster. A shape that didn't belong to the building or the fence or the shadows. A human shape, standing motionless in the gap between the dumpster and the chain-link fence, watching. Ghost's hand went to Duke's arm, squeezed once. The big man froze. Reaper saw the freeze and stopped. Elena, reading the sudden tension in every body around her, pulled Ivy close. The shape moved again, stepped forward, into the light from the one working street lamp. A man, average height, dark jacket, hands in his pockets, face obscured by a baseball cap pulled low. "Officer Brennan," the man said. His voice was conversational, pleasant almost. The voice of someone greeting a colleague at a company function. "You missed your check-in." Brennan's entire body went rigid. Ghost felt it through Duke's grip. A chain reaction of terror transmitted from one man's nervous system through physical contact to another. "That's him," Brennan whispered. "That's the handler." The man in the baseball cap took another step forward. His hands stayed in his pockets. His posture was relaxed, confident. The posture of a person who believed they were in control of the situation despite being outnumbered 4-1, which meant either he was delusional or he had a reason for the confidence that Ghost couldn't see. "I see you brought friends," the man said, looking at the bikers. "That's unfortunate. We prefer our relationships to be, exclusive." "Who are you?" Reaper said. "That's not really how this works." The man's head tilted slightly. "What I can tell you is that I represent people who've invested significant resources in this region. People who don't appreciate disruption. People who've spent 4 years building infrastructure that your little midnight ride is threatening to destroy." "Good," Ghost said. The man smiled. The same kind of small, controlled smile that Rourke had worn in the trailer. The smile of someone holding a card they believed was higher than yours. "You think you've won something tonight," the man said. "You found a trailer. You caught a profiler. You intercepted one local asset. You think that matters? We have profilers in 12 states, assets in twice that many cities, law enforcement contacts that go deeper than a single patrol officer in a town nobody's ever heard of. You've pulled one thread from a fabric that stretches across the entire western half of this country. And pulling threads doesn't destroy fabric. It just tells us where the weak points are." "You're standing in front of 4 men who've spent their lives in wars," Reaper said. "Choose your next words very carefully." "I'm standing in front of 4 men who've spent their lives losing wars," the man said. His voice didn't change, didn't harden, stayed pleasant. "That's what soldiers do, isn't it? They fight, and they lose, and they come home broken, and they join little clubs and ride their little motorcycles and pretend they're still relevant. But you're not relevant. You're a complication, and complications get resolved." He pulled one hand from his pocket. Not a weapon. A phone. He held it up so the screen faced the bikers. On it was a live image, a video feed, streaming in real time. A child's bedroom, a small bed with a dinosaur blanket, a nightlight casting orange shadows on the wall, and sitting on the bed, unaware of the camera, was a boy of about 9, reading a book with a flashlight under his covers. Caleb, Brennan's son. "That feed is live," the man said, "from a camera placed in the boys' room 6 months ago. The people watching that feed right now are not patient people. If Officer Brennan's cooperation ends tonight, the boys' safety ends tonight. If the information you've gathered reaches the FBI before we've had time to relocate our critical infrastructure, the boys' safety ends tonight. If any of you make a decision in the next 30 seconds that I don't approve of, the boys—" Duke moved. Ghost had seen Duke move fast before, in the trailer, through the window, across the outbuilding. But this was different. This was the speed of a man who'd spent 12 years as an Army Ranger and whose daughter was 12 years old and who was watching a 9-year-old boy used as a bargaining chip on a phone screen by a man in a parking lot at 4 in the morning. Duke covered the distance between himself and the handler in 3 strides and hit the man with a tackle so violent it lifted both of them off the ground. They landed on the wet asphalt with a sound like a car wreck. The phone skittered across the pavement. The handler's baseball cap flew off, revealing a face that was as unremarkable as every other face in this network. 40s, clean-shaven, the kind of face that parents trust and neighbors wave to and nobody remembers seeing because there's nothing to remember. Duke pinned him, both hands on the man's shoulders, knees on his arms. The weight differential was catastrophic. Duke had 60 pounds on the handler, and every one of those pounds was compressed rage. "Where's the camera?" Duke said. His voice shook, not with fear, with the effort of not killing the man beneath him. "Where's the boy?" The handler coughed, smiled through the cough, blood on his teeth from where his lip had split against the pavement. "Dead man's switch," the handler said. "I don't check in every 30 minutes. The team watching that feed executes the contingency. You've got about 22 minutes left on the current cycle." Ghost grabbed the phone from the pavement. The video feed was still live. The boy was still reading, still unaware, still safe in the false warmth of a bedroom that contained a camera placed there by people who'd been watching him for 6 months. "Delgado," Ghost said into his own phone. "Emergency. We need agents at—" He looked at Brennan. "What's the address?" Brennan gave it, shaking, barely standing, watching the live feed of his son on a stranger's phone while a biker held the man who controlled the camera against the pavement of a parking lot in a town that the world had forgotten. Ghost relayed the address. Delgado didn't ask questions. The line went dead, and Ghost knew. He knew with the certainty of a man who'd trusted this woman with his life in a war zone that she was already dialing, already mobilizing, already sending someone to Ben to get to that boy's bedroom before the 22 minutes expired. But 22 minutes was 22 minutes, and Ben was 2.5 hours from Portland, and the nearest FBI field office was in Eugene, 45 minutes away at best. Ghost looked at Reaper. Reaper looked at the phone, at the boy reading under his covers, at the timer that existed only in the handler's claim, but felt as real and as heavy as a bomb strapped to the underside of everything they'd built tonight. "He's bluffing," Reaper said, low, just a ghost. Dead man switches require infrastructure, reliable communication, contingency teams positioned and ready. This isn't a military operation. It's a criminal network, and criminal networks cut corners. And if he's not bluffing, then a 9-year-old boy in Bend has less than 20 minutes. Ghost felt the cage door inside his chest straining. The thing behind it, the violence, the rage, the capacity for destruction that the war had installed and the years had failed to remove, was pressing against the bars with a force that made his vision narrow and his breath come shallow and his hands go completely still. I know someone in Bend, Duke said. He was still on top of the handler, knees on arms, face inches from the man's bleeding smile. My ex-wife. She lives 4 blocks from Brennan's ex. If I call her, if I tell her what's happening, she can get to that house in 5 minutes. You haven't spoken to your ex-wife in 8 months, Reaper said. I know. She filed a restraining order, Duke. I know that too. Duke pulled out his phone with one hand while keeping the handler pinned with the other. He dialed a number and held the phone to his ear and waited while it rang in the dark, in the cold, in a parking lot where a child's drawing of purple flowers lay crumpled somewhere on a kitchen floor and a 9-year-old boy read under a dinosaur blanket 200 miles away, with no idea that his life depended on whether a woman who hated a man who loved her would answer her phone at 4 a.m. She answered on the 7th ring. Claire, Duke said, don't hang up. A boy is in danger. 1620 Maple Drive in Bend. His name is Caleb. He's 9. Someone is watching him through a camera in his bedroom, and I need you to get to that house and get him out. Right now. Right now, Claire. Ghost couldn't hear the response, but he watched Duke's face, watched it pass through something that looked like pain and fear and hope and the devastating vulnerability of a man asking the person who'd shut him out to save someone else's child. Thank you, Duke whispered, and hung up. The handler laughed, a wet, bloody sound that bubbled through split lips. You think a phone call fixes this? He said. You think one woman knocking on one door stops anything? We have people in 11 cities. We have assets you haven't even... Duke leaned down, close. So close their foreheads nearly touched. Stop talking, Duke said. The handler stopped talking. Ghost checked the time. 4:11 a.m. 47 minutes until Delgado's team was supposed to arrive. 20 minutes, give or take if the handler was telling the truth, before whatever contingency he'd described would trigger. 5 minutes, maybe less, before Claire Dunham covered 4 blocks of residential Bend in her car and knocked on a door and tried to convince a stranger that her son was being watched. Every variable was a guess. Every timeline was approximate. Every outcome depended on people Ghost couldn't see making decisions he couldn't control in places he couldn't reach. This was what helplessness felt like. Not the absence of action. He'd taken action all night, more action than most people take in a year. Helplessness was the gap between what you could do and what needed to be done. The distance between your reach and the throat of the thing trying to hurt the people you'd promised to protect. Reaper's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A flicker so brief it could have been imagined, except Ghost had known this man for 10 years and knew that flicker was the closest Reaper ever came to showing relief. Tomas, Reaper said. The FBI advance team just arrived at the trailer. 4 agents. They've secured Rourke, and they're imaging the servers. That's the evidence side, Ghost said. What about the field offices? The 11 other cities? Delgado says Portland field office has contacted Eugene, Boise, and Seattle. Teams mobilizing now. Now isn't good enough. Now means agents getting dressed, driving to offices, briefing supervisors, organizing convoys. Kids could be gone by the time they reach the addresses. I know. Ghost's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. Ghost. Claire Dunham's voice. Breathless, scared. The voice of a woman who'd been woken by a man she had a restraining order against and had chosen to act anyway because the word child rewires every calculation. I'm at the house. 1620 Maple. I knocked. The mother answered. I told her. I told her what Duke told me. She thinks I'm crazy. Put her on the phone. Rustling. Muffled voices. Then a new voice. suspicious, frightened, hostile. Who is this? It's 4 in the morning and there's a woman on my porch telling me someone is watching my son through a camera. I'm calling the... Don't call the police, Ghost said. The words came out with an urgency he couldn't modulate. Listen to me. Your name is... Are you Brennan's ex-wife? How do you know Your ex-husband is an officer in Black Hollow. Tonight he told us that a criminal network has been using him to gather intelligence on children, and they installed a camera in your son's bedroom as leverage to ensure his cooperation. I'm looking at a live feed of Caleb right now. He's reading under his covers with a flashlight, dinosaur blanket. The nightlight on the wall casts orange shadows. Silence. The silence of a mother processing information that cannot be true and yet contains details too specific to be invented. Then a scream. Not into the phone, away from it. The distant sound of a mother running toward her child's bedroom, and then a crash, and then the video feed on the handler's phone went dark. She'd found the camera, she'd ripped it out. Ghost looked at the handler on the pavement. The man's smile was gone, replaced by something Ghost had been waiting to see all night. The face of someone whose leverage had just evaporated. The face of a man who'd walked into a parking lot holding a dead man's switch and discovered the bomb had been defused by a woman in a bathrobe 4 blocks away. Your contingency is gone, Ghost said. Your profiler is in federal custody. Your local asset on Cedar Lane is zip-tied to a steering wheel. Your law enforcement contact is standing right there ready to testify. And in about 35 minutes, 22 FBI agents are going to arrive in this town and dismantle every piece of infrastructure your network spent 4 years building. The handler stared at the dark phone screen, at the dead video feed, at the absence of the only card he'd had left to play. You don't know what you've done, he said, but the confidence was gone. The pleasant voice was gone. What remained was hollow, the echo inside an empty structure. Yeah, Ghost said, we do. Sirens in the distance, faint, growing, coming from the direction of the highway. Not local police, not Brennan's compromised department, but federal vehicles moving fast through the Oregon dark. Reaper heard them too. He looked at Ghost, at Duke, at Brennan, at Elena holding Ivy on the staircase, the child's face buried against her mother's neck, the butterfly backpack hanging from one small hand. And then Reaper did something Ghost had never seen in 10 years. He smiled. It lasted less than a second. A crack in the granite, a fracture in the mask that healed as quickly as it appeared. But Ghost saw it, and it meant everything it needed to mean. That the man who hadn't smiled since his daughter was taken had found, in this frozen parking lot at 4 in the morning, surrounded by broken men and terrified women and sleeping children and the approaching sound of justice finally arriving, a reason to believe that some things could still be saved. The sirens grew louder. Red and blue light appeared on the horizon, reflecting off wet pavement and chrome motorcycles, and the exhausted faces of men who'd ridden through the night and fought through the dark and held the line until someone with a badge and a warrant could take over. Ghost sat down on the curb. His legs gave out. Not dramatically. Just the quiet surrender of a body that had been running on adrenaline and rage for 7 hours and had finally spent both currencies down to nothing. His hands shook. Both of them now, not just the right. His jaw ached where Brennan had hit him. His shoulder throbbed from breaking down the trailer door. His eyes burned from wind and cold, and the kind of fatigue that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from the sustained effort of caring about something so fiercely that it consumes every reserve you have. Ivy appeared beside him. He didn't hear her come down the stairs. She was just there, the way she'd been at the gas station. A sudden presence, small and warm and impossibly brave. She sat down next to him on the curb. Her butterfly backpack sat between them. Are the sirens for us? She asked. They're for the bad people, Ghost said. Are you sure? Yeah, kid, I'm sure. Ivy leaned against his arm. Her head barely reached his shoulder. She smelled like hot chocolate and the laundry detergent her mother used and the particular warmth of a child who'd been carried through the cold on a motorcycle by a stranger who became something else. The first FBI vehicle pulled into the parking lot, headlights sweeping across the scene like a searchlight finding survivors. Doors opened. Agents in tactical vests stepped out. Radios crackled. Commands were issued in the precise, clipped language of people who knew exactly what they were here to do. And Ghost sat on the curb with a 7-year-old girl leaning against his arm and watched the cavalry arrive and felt, for the first time in years, like maybe the war had given him something useful after all. Not the tremor, not the scars, not the dead look in his eyes that frightened children in grocery stores, but the ability to stand in the dark and hold the line until morning came. The FBI took the parking lot apart in 40 minutes. Agents moved through Ridgewood Terrace with the systematic efficiency of people trained to process chaos into evidence, photographing the police cruiser, cataloging Brennan's radio fragments from the kitchen floor, placing the handler in federal handcuffs that clicked shut with a sound so final it felt like punctuation at the end of a sentence the whole night had been writing. 2 agents escorted Brennan into a separate vehicle, his wrists cuffed in front because he was cooperating, and because the lead agent, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the measured calm of someone who'd managed crisis scenes for decades, understood the difference between a criminal and a man who'd been turned into one. Ghost watched it all from the curb. He hadn't moved. His legs had stopped working in the way that legs stop working when the body decides, unilaterally and without consultation, that it has reached its operational limit and will not be taking further requests. The tremor in his right hand had spread to his left. Both hands lay in his lap, shaking with a rhythm that matched nothing. Not his heartbeat, not his breathing, not the cold, just shaking. The body's way of releasing what the mind refused to process. Ivy had fallen asleep against his arm. She'd fought it. He'd felt her fighting it, the small jerks of a child startling herself awake, the tightening of her fingers on his sleeve each time her head dipped, the stubborn refusal to surrender consciousness in a world that had proven, repeatedly and without mercy, that bad things happened when she closed her eyes. But exhaustion is a force that even the bravest 7-year-olds cannot defeat, and at some point between the arrival of the 3rd FBI vehicle and the departure of the handler in the back of a federal sedan, Ivy's grip loosened, her breathing slowed, and she slept. Ghost didn't move his arm. He let it go numb, let the blood pool and the nerves compress and the muscle ache. A small price, the smallest price he'd ever paid for anything that mattered. Agent Rachel Delgado found him at 5:17 a.m. She looked different than he remembered. 3 years had added lines around her eyes and a hardness to her jaw that hadn't been there during their service together. She wore a tactical vest over a button-down shirt that she'd clearly thrown on in the dark, one side untucked, collar creased wrong. Her badge hung from a lanyard around her neck. Her sidearm sat on her hip in a retention holster that she touched reflexively every few minutes, the way Ghost touched his vest pocket where the dead cigarette butts lived. She stood in front of him and looked down at the sleeping child against his arm and said nothing for a long time. "You look like hell," she finally said. "Feel like it too." "The girl?" "Ivy Mercer, 7. She's the one who started all of this." Delgado crouched down. Not to examine Ivy, to meet Ghost at eye level, the way you approach someone who's been through something and needs to be met where they are, not pulled to where you think they should be. "We got to 9 of the 11, she said. Ghost's chest tightened. 9. 9 confirmed safe. Field agents reached the addresses and made contact with families. 9 children are in protective custody as of 20 minutes ago. And the other 2? Delgado's face changed, not dramatically, a shift in the muscles around her eyes. The kind of micro-expression that people who deliver bad news for a living develop as a replacement for the kind they can't afford to show. One family in Boise. The address on file was outdated. Family moved 3 months ago. We're tracking them through county records. They're not in immediate danger because the network's Boise asset was arrested an hour ago on an unrelated warrant. He was already in custody before the acquisition order came through. That's 10. What about 11? Delgado paused. A 6-year-old boy in Tacoma, Marcus Webb. When agents reached the address, the grandmother who watches him said he was at a sleepover. We contacted the sleepover family. He's safe. He was eating cereal and watching cartoons when the agents called. Ghost closed his eyes. 11 for 11. 13 if you counted Ivy and Lily Vasquez. 13 children who would wake up this morning in beds that were still their own, in homes that were still standing, in lives that had been targeted for destruction and were instead through a chain of events that began with a tiny hand grabbing the back of a leather vest in the rain, still intact. Rourke? Ghost asked. In federal custody, singing like a bird. His attorney hasn't even arrived yet, and he's already given us names, dates, financial records. The server data Tomas preserved is the most comprehensive intelligence package on a trafficking network that the Portland field office has ever received. It's going to take months to process, but the preliminary analysis suggests connections to operations in at least 8 states. The handler? The one Duke tackled? Real name is Martin Coyle. No prior record, which is consistent with the network's recruitment pattern. Clean backgrounds, community ties, invisible. He's not talking, but he doesn't need to. We have his phone, the video feed he was using to monitor Brennan's son, and the communication logs that link him to the server. He's done. Brennan. Delgado's expression shifted again. This time, Ghost recognized it. The expression of a federal agent navigating the morally complicated territory between justice and compassion. Brennan is going to face charges, she said. There's no avoiding that. 22 months of obstruction, evidence suppression, accessory counts for every acquisition that occurred during his period of cooperation. But his testimony about being coerced through threats to his son, combined with his cooperation tonight, will factor significantly into sentencing. He's not going to walk free, but he's also not going to disappear. And his son? Caleb is safe. The camera has been removed. Brennan's ex-wife is cooperating fully with our agents. The boy doesn't know what happened. His mother told him there was a power surge that affected some electronics in the house, and he accepted it because he's 9, and power surges are boring, and the book he was reading was not. Ghost almost smiled. Almost. The expression got as far as the corners of his mouth before the exhaustion pulled it back down. Meridian Analytics, he said. The hub in Salem that Brennan mentioned. SWAT hit it at 4:45 a.m. 4 individuals detained. Servers seized, financial records secured. It's going to be the biggest federal trafficking prosecution in the Pacific Northwest in over a decade, Ghost. And it started because a little girl grabbed your vest at a gas station. Delgado stood up, looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between pride and grief, and the particular sadness of a person who understands that the man in front of her could have been so many things and chose to be this. I'm sorry I didn't call, Ghost said. You're sorry you didn't call. For 3 years, I should have... Ghost, she held up one hand. You rode through a freezing night, broke into a predator's trailer, uncovered a trafficking network, protected 2 children, exposed a compromised officer, and handed the FBI enough evidence to save 13 kids and prosecute dozens of criminals. You can apologize for the phone call later. Right now I need you to give your statement to Agent Marcos over there, and then I need you to go somewhere warm and sleep before you fall over. She walked away, then stopped, turned back. Ryder, his real name. She was the only person outside of DMV records who used it. Yeah? You did good tonight. The men you rode with did good. I know the law doesn't always make room for what happened here, and I know some of the things your club did tonight fall into gray areas that my reports will have to address carefully. But those 13 families are going to wake up tomorrow with their children still in their homes, and that matters more than any procedural argument a defense attorney is going to make. She turned and walked toward the command vehicle, and Ghost watched her go, and something that had been knotted inside his chest for 3 years loosened by a single turn. The sun came up at 6:42 a.m. Not dramatically, not the cinematic sunrise that movies use to signal that the darkness is over and the world is clean. An Oregon winter sunrise, gray light seeping through gray clouds, turning the sky from black to charcoal to the color of old dishwater. The kind of sunrise that doesn't promise anything except that the planet is still turning and another day is starting whether you're ready for it or not. Ghost was ready. He carried Ivy to Elena's borrowed car, a vehicle provided by the FBI's Victim Services Coordinator, a practical sedan with a car seat that someone had installed while Ghost was giving his statement. Ivy didn't wake during the transfer. She curled into the car seat with the instinctive trust of a child who'd decided, somewhere in the terrible hours of the night, that the arms carrying her were safe. Elena stood beside the car. She looked like she'd aged 5 years and 7 hours. Her eyes were swollen. Her hands clutched the car keys so tightly, her knuckles were white. She watched Ghost buckle Ivy into the seat with a gentleness that seemed to confuse her. This man with scars and tattoos and a leather vest that smelled like engine oil and cigarettes, handling her daughter as if she were made of something precious. "I don't know how to thank you," Elena said. "Don't need to. I was wrong about her, about the car. She told me and I didn't listen. You were tired, Elena. You were working double shifts and raising a kid alone and surviving on 4 hours of sleep. You didn't dismiss her because you didn't care. You dismissed her because your body and your brain were running on fumes, and you couldn't afford to believe the world was that dangerous because you didn't have the resources to fight it." Elena's face crumpled, not into tears, into the raw, unguarded expression of a woman hearing her own pain described by someone who understood it, not because he'd studied it, but because he'd lived adjacent to it his entire life. "She trusts you," Elena said. "I don't know why. I've never seen her trust anyone that fast." Kids know things adults have forgotten how to see. Elena reached out and touched his arm. Just a touch. Brief. The contact of one damaged person acknowledging another. "Will we see you again?" she asked. Ghost looked at Ivy sleeping in the car seat, butterfly backpack on her lap, lips slightly parted, the faintest trace of hot chocolate still visible at the corner of her mouth. "Yeah," he said. "You will." He didn't make promises he couldn't keep, but this one he could. This one he would. The Iron Vultures regrouped at a diner on Route 7 that opened at 6 and didn't ask questions about why 22 men in leather walked through the door looking like they'd been through a war. The diner was called May's, and it had been there since 1974, and the woman who ran it, May's granddaughter, a 60-year-old named Donna, with forearms like a longshoreman and a coffee pot that never seemed to empty, took one look at the bikers filling every booth and every counter stool and said, "You boys look like you need the works." Nobody argued. Ghost sat at the counter between Reaper and Duke. The coffee was too hot and too strong and tasted like the best thing Ghost had ever put in his mouth. The warmth spread through his hands, through his chest, into the cold places that the night had hollowed out. Steam rose from the mug and fogged his vision, and he let it, because for the first time in 7 hours he didn't need to see clearly. He just needed to sit still and breathe and let the heat do its work. Reaper held his coffee the same way he always did, both hands, careful, like something fragile. But something about the way he held it was different this morning. Ghost noticed it and couldn't name it at first, and then he could. Reaper was holding the mug the way a man holds something he's not afraid of losing, not gripping, not clutching, just holding. "Delgado called," Reaper said. "Meridian Analytics is gutted. 4 arrests. One of them was a woman named Carver, the one Brennan mentioned. She had direct connections to buyers in 11 cities. The financial trail goes through 3 shell companies and ends at accounts in 2 countries. It's going to take the feds years to untangle it all, but the operational network is done. The pipeline is shut down." "What about the 87? Ghost asked. The number that had been sitting in his chest like a stone since Tomas showed him the spreadsheet in the trailer. 87 completed transfers, 87 children who'd already gone through the machine. Delgado says the transaction logs include enough identifying information to trace most of them. It's going to be the largest recovery operation in FBI history. Some of those kids have been missing for years, Ghost. Some of them are in states they've never heard of, living under names that aren't theirs, with people who aren't their families. Finding them is going to be a process. But the data is there, the map exists. They know where to look." Ghost nodded. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. 87 children had been stolen, and no amount of data or federal resources or courtroom convictions could give them back the time that was taken. But it was a start. It was the difference between a wound that never heals and a wound that might. Duke sat to Ghost's right, eating scrambled eggs with the focused determination of a man replacing calories that had been burned by stress and violence and the particular metabolic cost of sustained moral outrage. His phone sat face up on the counter beside his plate. He checked it every 30 seconds. "Claire?" Ghost asked. Duke nodded. "She texted. Caleb's okay. She's staying with Brennan's ex-wife until the FBI security detail arrives." "How'd she sound?" Duke paused, set down his fork. stared at his coffee for a moment. She said she didn't know I had it in me, Duke said. To call her like that. To ask for help. She said she thought I was too proud. Were you? Yeah. Until tonight. Duke picked up his fork and went back to his eggs. But something in his posture had shifted. A loosening in the shoulders. A settling in the spine. The posture of a man who'd opened a door he'd thought was locked forever and found that the person on the other side had been waiting. Coffin arrived at the diner 40 minutes later, having turned over his position at Cedar Lane to the FBI security detail assigned to Lily Vasquez and her grandmother. He walked through the door with the particular exhaustion of a man who'd spent 2 hours standing guard in the cold watching a 7-year-old's house and thinking about every child he'd failed to save during 3 tours as a combat medic. The ones who stepped on IEDs, the ones caught in crossfires, the ones who bled out in his arms in dusty villages with names he still couldn't pronounce without his throat closing. He sat down at the counter. Donna poured him coffee without being asked. Coffin wrapped his mismatched hands around the mug and stared into the steam. The grandmother came out, Coffin said. Lily's grandmother, around 5:30. She brought me tamales. Tamales, Ghost said, homemade in tinfoil. She didn't speak much English, but she held my hands and she looked at me and she said gracias and she cried and then she went back inside. And I stood there holding tamales in the cold and Coffin stopped. His jaw worked. The misaligned bones shifted under his skin. I don't know. It felt like something I hadn't felt in a long time. Nobody asked him to name it. Some things live beneath language, in the spaces between nerve endings, in the places where the body remembers what the mind has learned to forget. The men at the counter understood this because they all carried their own version of it, the hunger for a moment of grace in a life defined by its absence. Tomas arrived last. He came through the diner door with a laptop bag over one shoulder and shadows under his eyes so deep they looked painted. He'd spent the entire night with the FBI's digital forensics team, walking them through the server architecture, translating the encrypted communications, cataloging 4 years of transactional data with the methodical precision that his military intelligence background had drilled into him like a second language. He sat down. Didn't order coffee. Didn't order food. I need to tell you something, Tomas said. He wasn't looking at anyone. His eyes were fixed on the counter surface, tracing a scratch in the formica with one fingernail. Talk, Reaper said. When I was going through the server logs tonight, I found communication records going back to the network's founding, organizational charts, recruitment protocols, training documents for new assets. Tomas paused. One of the training documents described how to identify and approach vulnerable law enforcement officers for recruitment. It used a case study, an example of a successfully turned officer. Brennan, Ghost said. No. Tomas looked up. The case study was from 6 years ago. A different state, a different officer, but the methodology was identical. Identify a vulnerability, apply pressure through a loved one, convert the target into a long-term intelligence asset. Thomas swallowed. The case study subject was a military intelligence analyst turned federal contractor who was compromised through threats to his sister's family. The documents included his profile, his operational history, his debrief after he was released from the network's control. The diner was quiet. Donna stood at the far end of the counter, coffee pot in hand, sensing the gravity without understanding it. The profile was mine, Tomas said. Ghost set down his mug. Reaper's hands tightened around his own. Duke stopped chewing. 6 years ago, Tomas continued, before the club, before any of you knew me, I was contracted to a federal task force investigating organized crime in the Southwest. A man approached me, showed me photographs of my sister's kids, my niece and nephew in Tucson, told me he needed access to intelligence databases, told me what would happen if I refused. Tomas's voice was steady, but his hands were not. I gave him what he wanted. For 4 months, I fed information to people I knew were criminals, because the alternative was my sister's children ending up in a file like the ones we found tonight. How did it end? Reaper asked. His voice carried no judgment, no anger, just the question. My sister moved. I arranged it. New city, new names, disappeared her family off the grid. Then I resigned my clearance, destroyed everything that connected me to the task force, and rode west until I found a group of people who didn't ask about my past. Us, Ghost said. You. Tomas finally looked at each of them. I found the Iron Vultures at a rally in Reno. You were the first people in years who didn't want anything from me except honesty, and I couldn't even give you that. I've been carrying this for 6 years, and tonight, when I saw Brennan's face, when I heard him describe being turned through threats to his child, I was looking at a mirror. That was me. That was exactly me. Reaper set down his mug, stood up from the counter stool, walked to where Tomas sat and stood beside him, not touching, not speaking, just present. The way a tree stands beside another tree in a storm, not to shelter it, but to remind it that roots hold. You're here now, Reaper said. What you did 6 years ago, under duress, to protect children in your own family, that's not betrayal. That's the same thing we did tonight, the same calculation, the same impossible choice. I should have told you. Yeah, you should have, but you're telling us now, and that counts. Tomas nodded. His eyes were wet, but his face was still. The face of a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying so long it had become part of his skeleton, and feeling the bones rearrange in its absence. Donna refilled their coffees, brought more eggs, brought toast and bacon and hash browns and orange juice in small glasses that the bikers' hands made look like dollhouse furniture. The food arrived in waves, and the men ate in the slow, deliberate way that people eat after a crisis. Not because they were hungry, but because the act of consuming something warm and ordinary was itself a form of healing, a return to the baseline rhythms of a body that needed fuel and warmth and the simple animal comfort of sitting beside other bodies in a safe space. Ghost ate without tasting. His mind was already moving forward, past the diner, past the debriefs, past the federal machinery that would grind through the network's remnants for months and years. He was thinking about Ivy, about what came next for a 7-year-old girl who'd been brave enough to grab a stranger's vest in the rain and ask for help and had, through that single act of terrified courage, set in motion a chain of events that saved 13 children and exposed a criminal empire. What came next was the hardest part. Not the investigation, not the trial, the after. The slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding a sense of safety that had been shattered. The nightmares that would come, not if, when. The flinching at gray sedans, the checking of locks, the long process of learning to trust a world that had given her every reason not to. Ghost knew this because he'd been living his own version of it for 20 years and still hadn't figured it out. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the figuring out wasn't something you did alone. Maybe it was something that happened between people. In the space between a tiny hand and a leather vest, between a mug of hot chocolate and a scarred set of knuckles, between a girl who was brave enough to ask for help and a man who was broken enough to understand why she needed it, 2 years later. Black Hollow had changed, not dramatically. It was still a small Oregon town with a dying mill and 2 bars and weather that couldn't decide between rain and snow for 6 months of the year. But the changes were there if you knew where to look. A new streetlight on Franklin Avenue, installed after a community petition organized by Elena Mercer and signed by 400 residents. A youth center on Cedar Lane, funded by an anonymous donation that Ghost suspected came from Delgado's discretionary budget but could never prove. A renovated apartment complex at Ridgewood Terrace where the locks worked and the pipes ran clean and the exterior lights stayed on all night because the new property management company understood that darkness was not a feature. The Iron Vultures held their annual winter charity ride on the first Saturday of December. 200 motorcycles lined Main Street. Not just vultures, but riders from 6 clubs across Oregon and Washington who'd heard the story and wanted to be part of something that mattered. Families lined the sidewalks. Children waved. The sound of engines filled the town like a second heartbeat, and for one day the machines that most people associated with danger and lawlessness became the sound of something different. Ghost stood beside his bike at the staging area behind May's Diner, adjusting his gloves when he felt the tug. Different this time. Not desperate, not trembling, confident. The tug of a child who'd learned that reaching for someone didn't always mean reaching into the dark. He turned. Ivy Mercer stood behind him. 9 years old now, taller, stronger. Hair brushed and braided by a mother who'd cut her shifts to single coverage after the FBI's Victim Assistance Program helped her find a better-paying job at the county clerk's office. Ivy wore jeans, boots, and a small leather vest that the Iron Vultures had presented to her at a club gathering 8 months ago. Custom-fitted, hand-stitched by a brother named Sal, who'd done leather work in prison and now ran a legitimate shop on Route 7. The vest carried one patch, centered on the back, hand-embroidered, Honorary Vulture. "Hey, kid," Ghost said. "Hey, Ghost." She said his name the way club brothers did, with the easy familiarity of someone who'd earned the right to use it. Not as a stranger, not as an outsider, as family. "You ready for the ride?" Ghost asked. "Born ready." She grinned, a real grin, the kind that reached her eyes and stayed there without the shadow of something darker pulling it back. "My counselor says I've made excellent progress with my anxiety responses." "Yeah? What else does your counselor say?" "She says that brave people ask for help. She's been saying that since I was 7. I think she only has like 4 sayings." "Is the plant still dying?" Ivy laughed. "She got a new one, a cactus. She says it's harder to kill." Ghost felt the thing behind his ribs again. Not the crack, not the fracture, the loosening. The slow tectonic shift of something that had been locked in place for years finally finding room to move. It wasn't happiness. He wasn't sure he had the wiring for happiness in the way that other people described it. It was something more fundamental. The sensation of a man who'd spent 2 decades believing he was too damaged to protect anything good, realizing, in the presence of a child who'd healed because he'd stood between her and the dark, that the belief was wrong. Not entirely wrong. He was damaged. The tremor was still there, would always be there. The scar still ran crooked from his eyebrow to his jaw. The nightmares still came, less frequent now but no less vivid. He still couldn't sleep facing a wall, still counted exits in every room he entered, still carried the war inside his head like a second passenger who refused to leave. But damaged wasn't the same as useless. Broken wasn't the same as empty. And the things the war had put inside him, the hypervigilance, the combat calm, the ability to hold a line in the dark, those things hadn't been flaws. They'd been tools, terrible tools, forged in terrible places, waiting for a purpose that the war itself could never have provided. Ivy climbed onto the back of Ghost's bike the way she'd done a dozen times in the past 2 years. At charity rides, at club events, at the 4th of July parade where she'd sat behind him and waved a small flag while 200 motorcycles rolled down Main Street, and Elena stood on the sidewalk crying in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. Elena was here today, standing near the diner entrance with a cup of coffee, talking to Duke's ex-wife Claire, who'd driven down from Bend with Duke's daughter, a 12-year-old named Sophie who thought motorcycles were cool and her father's leather vest was embarrassing, the way 12-year-olds think everything about their parents is embarrassing, even when they secretly think it's the greatest thing in the world. Duke stood beside them. He and Claire weren't back together, might never be. But the restraining order was gone, and the weekend visits had become weekly, and sometimes Claire called him just to tell him something Sophie had said or done, and Duke received those calls the way a man receives water in a desert, with both hands, without pride, grateful. Coffin sat on his bike at the front of the formation, smoking his last cigarette before the ride. He'd quit twice and relapsed twice, and was currently on his 3rd attempt, which Ghost gave about the same odds as the first 2. But the tamales had become a tradition. Every month, Coffin rode to Cedar Lane and had dinner with Lily Vasquez's grandmother, who'd learned his name and taught him 3 words in Spanish, and knitted him a scarf that he wore on every ride even though it was bright orange and clashed with everything. Tomas stood at the back of the formation, phone in his pocket instead of his hand, eyes forward instead of scanning. His disclosure at the diner had cost him 2 months of tension within the club. Hard conversations, difficult questions, the slow process of rebuilding trust that had been compromised by 6 years of silence. But Reaper had stood beside him through all of it, and the brothers had eventually arrived at the same conclusion. Tomas had been caught in the same machine they'd dismantled, and judging him for surviving it was no different from judging Brennan. Brennan was serving an 18-month sentence at a minimum security facility in southern Oregon, reduced from a potential 12 years based on his cooperation and the documented coercion of his son. Caleb visited once a month with his mother. Brennan would be out before the boy turned 11. Ghost didn't know what kind of man Brennan would be when he emerged, but he knew what kind of man Brennan was trying to become, and sometimes trying was the only metric that mattered. Reaper walked to the front of the formation. 200 riders sat on 200 motorcycles, engines off, waiting. The street was lined with families. The sky was clear, rare for December in Oregon, a gift from a universe that occasionally remembered to be kind. Reaper didn't give a speech. Speeches weren't his language. He stood in front of the formation and looked at his brothers and the riders from other clubs and the families on the sidewalks and the children sitting on shoulders and waving, and he nodded once. That was enough. 200 engines fired in sequence, a rolling cascade of sound that started at the front and moved backward through the formation like a wave, each Harley catching and roaring until the combined sound was a physical thing, a vibration in the asphalt, in the buildings, in the bones of every person standing close enough to feel it. The sound shook the windows of May's diner. It rattled the new streetlight on Franklin Avenue. It echoed off the mountains that surrounded Black Hollow like a voice calling out across empty space, not expecting an answer but needing to make the sound anyway. Ghost twisted the throttle. Ivy's arms tightened around his waist. Her butterfly backpack, new, bigger, replaced twice since the night at the gas station, but always a butterfly, pressed against his spine. "Ready?" he called over his shoulder. "Ready?" she called back. The formation moved. 200 motorcycles rolling through the center of a town that had once feared the iron vultures and now lined the streets to wave as they passed. Ghost rode in the middle of the pack, exactly where he belonged. Not at the front, not at the back, but in the center, surrounded by brothers, carrying a child who'd taught him that the strongest thing a person can do is ask for help. The sound of the engines filled the valley. The winter sun caught the chrome and threw light across the faces of people who'd come to watch, people who'd come to remember, people who'd come because they understood that the rumble of a Harley engine didn't have to mean danger. It could mean something else. It could mean that somewhere in the cold, someone was riding toward you instead of away. Ghost felt Ivy press her cheek against his back, felt the warmth of her through the leather, felt the tremor in his right hand quiet. Not stop, never stop, but quiet. As if the vibration of the engine had given it something to harmonize with instead of fight against. The road opened ahead. Miles of clear Oregon highway stretched toward the mountains, and the formation rode into it together. And the sound they made was the sound of something that couldn't be broken because it had already been broken and had chosen, despite everything, to hold. And behind them, standing on the sidewalk outside May's diner with a coffee cup in one hand and the other pressed flat against her chest, where her heart was doing something she couldn't name, Elena Mercer watched her daughter ride away on the back of a motorcycle driven by a scarred, shaking, imperfect man who'd answered a whisper in a rainstorm and changed the entire shape of the world. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. Ivy was already home.